Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. Hey everyone, if you enjoy my content, don't forget to check out my second channel. The link is in the description or the comments. Your support means the world to me. This happened in 1983. I stood in front of my cabin, taking a deep breath. Achoo! I sneezed, cursing my allergies. I hate plants, I muttered, rubbing my nose. My name is Finnegan McDougal, a recently divorced tech salesman who traded the busy city life for the peaceful forest of Tallwood, Idaho. Grateful for the solitude, I began unpacking my things. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils as I lugged the last of my boxes from the car to the modest log cabin I now called home. At 35 years old, I never imagined I'd be starting over in a place like this. The divorce had been messy, leaving me drained both emotionally and financially. This move to Tallwood was meant to be a fresh start, a chance to reconnect with myself away from the chaos of city life and the painful memories of my failed marriage. As I placed the final box on the cabin's creaky wooden floor, I paused to survey my new surroundings. The interior was rustic but cozy. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, while a stone fireplace dominated the opposite wall. A narrow staircase led to a loft bedroom, and a tiny bathroom was tucked beneath it. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the dense forest that surrounded the property. The realtor had mentioned something about hiking trails nearby, and I made a mental note to explore them once I was settled. For now, though, I had unpacking to do. As I worked through the boxes, arranging my meager possessions around the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance out the window, half expecting to see someone or something staring back at me. But there was never anything there, just the gently swaying trees and the occasional bird flitting between branches. Get a grip, Finnegan, I muttered to myself. You're just not used to all this nature. By the time night fell, I had made decent progress with the unpacking. Exhausted, I heated up a can of soup on the small stove and sat down at the rickety kitchen table to eat. The silence was deafening. In the city, there had always been a constant backdrop of noise, traffic, sirens, neighbors. Here, the quiet was punctuated only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. As I prepared for bed, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The darkness outside seemed absolute, pressing against the windows like a living thing. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before climbing the stairs to the loft. Lying in bed, staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, I tried to convince myself that I had made the right decision. This was a chance to start over, to find peace and purpose away from the rat race. But as I drifted off to sleep, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. What if I had made a terrible mistake? The next morning, I awoke to sunlight streaming through the small window in the loft. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings jarring my senses. Then reality settled in, and I remembered where I was. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and toast, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The realtor had mentioned hiking trails, and I figured a walk would do me good. I pulled on a pair of sturdy boots, grabbed a water bottle, and headed out. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. As I walked along the edge of the property, I noticed a faint path leading into the woods. It wasn't marked on any of the maps I had been given, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow it and see where it led. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, clearly not maintained like the official hiking paths. As I pushed deeper into the forest, the canopy above grew denser, filtering out much of the sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I found myself wishing I had brought a jacket. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a small clearing. What I saw there made me stop in my tracks. In the center of the clearing was an abandoned campsite. Tattered tents sagged on bent poles, and overturned camping chairs lay scattered about. A fire pit sat in the middle, and to my shock, I could see wisps of smoke rising from the ashes. My heart began to race. Someone had been here recently, very recently, but where were they now? And why had they left in such a hurry? I approached the campsite cautiously, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The eerie silence of the forest seemed to press in around me. As I got closer to the fire pit, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the soft earth around the campsite, dozens of them, all leading away in the same direction. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. The footprints led me deeper into the woods, away from the trail I'd been following. The forest grew darker and more oppressive with each step. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Suddenly, the footprints stopped. I found myself standing in front of a massive hollow tree trunk, its bark gnarled and twisted with age. Something about it sent a shiver down my spine. As I peered into the hollow, my eyes widened in shock. Inside the trunk lay two items that seemed entirely out of place in this wild setting. The first was a small revolver, its metal glinting dully in the dim light. Next to it was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and marred by water stains. With trembling hands, I reached in and retrieved both items. The revolver was heavier than I expected, and I handled it gingerly, unsure if it was loaded. The journal's cover was embossed with a name, Mavis Abernathy. I opened the journal, my curiosity overcoming my fear. The handwriting inside was spidery and difficult to read, but as I skimmed the pages, certain phrases jumped out at me. Something in the woods. Not human. Others have seen it too. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was reading. This Mavis Abernathy, whoever she was, had encountered something terrifying in these woods, and judging by the state of the abandoned campsite, she might not have been the only one. As the implications of what I had found began to sink in, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest suddenly seemed alive with menace, every shadow potentially concealing some unknown threat. I shoved the journal into my pocket and, after a moment's hesitation, grabbed the revolver as well. Then, trying to keep my panic under control, I began to make my way back towards my cabin as quickly and quietly as I could. The trek back seemed to take an eternity. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. By the time I finally stumbled out of the woods and saw my cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it, panting heavily. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The abandoned campsite, the mysterious footprints, the journal with its ominous warnings. It all seemed like something out of a horror movie. But this wasn't a movie. This was real, and I was living it. As night fell, I sat at the kitchen table, the revolver and journal laid out in front of me. I knew I should probably call the ranger's office, report what I had found. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of not being believed, or maybe it was a morbid curiosity to uncover more about what was happening in these woods. Either way, as I finally crawled into bed that night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees outside set my nerves on edge. And all the while, one question kept running through my mind. What had I gotten myself into? The next morning, I awoke feeling groggy and unrested. The events of the previous day seemed almost like a dream, but the presence of the revolver and journal on my bedside table confirmed their reality. I knew I needed to examine the journal more closely, to try and understand what Mavis Abernathy had experienced in these woods. After a quick breakfast, I settled down at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and opened the journal. The first few pages were filled with innocuous observations about the local flora and fauna, interspersed with sketches of plants and animals. Mavis, it seemed, had been an artist who came to these woods seeking inspiration. But as I read on, the tone of the entries began to change. About a third of the way through the journal, I came across an entry that made my blood run cold. May 15th, 1967. Something strange happened today. I was sketching by the creek when I heard an odd sound, like a mix between a growl and a human moan. When I looked up, I saw something moving in the underbrush across the water. It was large, much larger than any animal I've seen in these woods before. For a moment I thought I saw a face, almost human, but not quite. Then it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The entries that followed became increasingly paranoid and frantic. Mavis wrote about hearing strange noises at night, finding large, unidentifiable footprints around her campsite, and glimpsing shadowy figures moving through the trees. She also mentioned other campers and hikers who had gone missing in the area over the years. One particular entry caught my attention. June 3rd, 1967. I met another hiker today, a man named Gerald. He's been coming to these woods for years, and when I told him about what I've been experiencing, he didn't seem surprised. He told me there are old legends about these forests, stories of a creature that's neither man nor beast. The local indigenous people called it the Wendigo, a spirit of hunger and winter that possesses humans and turns them into monstrous cannibals. I don't know if I believe in such things, but after what I've seen, I can't discount it entirely. Gerald said he's going to do some more research. He promised to meet me back here in a week with more information. The next entry was dated a week later. June 10th, 1967. Gerald never showed up. I waited all day at our meeting spot, but he never came. I'm worried something might have happened to him. The forest feels different now, more menacing somehow. I don't feel safe here anymore. I'm going to leave tomorrow, head back to civilization. But first, I need to hide this journal and the gun Gerald gave me for protection. If something happens to me, I want there to be a record of what I've seen. If anyone finds this, be careful. There's something in these woods, something dangerous. That was the last entry. My hands were shaking as I closed the journal. The implications of what I had read were terrifying. If Mavis was to be believed, something inhuman was stalking these woods, and had been for decades. I spent the rest of the day poring over the journal, trying to glean any additional information. Mavis had included rough maps of the area, marking spots where she had encountered strange phenomena. To my horror, I realized that several of these locations were uncomfortably close to my cabin. As night fell, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The forest outside my windows seemed to press in, full of hidden threats. I found myself jumping at every sound, my imagination conjuring terrifying images of what might be lurking in the darkness. I tried to rationalize what I had read. Surely this was all just the product of an overactive imagination. Mavis had been alone in the woods for too long, had let the isolation get to her. There had to be a logical explanation for the missing hikers, the strange sounds, the glimpses of something not quite human moving through the trees. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, the revolver clutched tightly in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Something was out there, hidden in the shadows of the forest, and it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself. As the days passed, I found myself falling into an uneasy routine. During the daylight hours, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. I continued unpacking, made trips into town for supplies, and even attempted to do some work remotely. But as soon as the sun began to set, anxiety would creep in. I took to keeping the revolver close at hand, its weight both comforting and terrifying. I knew I should report my findings to the authorities, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the fear of not being believed, of being labeled as just another city slicker who couldn't handle the solitude of the woods. It was on the 5th night after my discovery of the journal that things took a turn for the worse. I had been having trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and inhuman screams. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It started as a low moan, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a sound of pain, of hunger, of something not quite human, and it was coming from just outside my cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The moaning continued, interspersed with what sounded like heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I reached for the revolver on my bedside table, my palms slick with sweat. Slowly, carefully, I made my way down the stairs to the main room of the cabin. The moaning had stopped, but I could still hear movement outside. Something was out there, moving around the cabin, testing the walls and windows. I crouched by one of the windows, trying to peer out into the darkness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving the forest in near total blackness. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin, where visible, was a sickly pale color stretched tight over protruding bones. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was almost human, but wrong somehow. The eyes were too large, sunken deep into the skull. The mouth was a gash filled with sharp, yellowed teeth. As I watched, frozen in horror, the creature's head swiveled towards the cabin. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure it was looking right at me. Then, with a speed that belied its gangly frame, it was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I remained by the window for what felt like hours, the revolver clutched tightly in my shaking hands. But the creature didn't return. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. What I had seen defied explanation. It couldn't have been human. No person could move like that, could look like that. But if not human, then what? The word from Mavis's journal echoed in my mind. Wendigo. As the sun rose, bathing the forest in a deceptively peaceful light, I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there, whatever I had seen, it wasn't safe. I needed to leave, to get back to civilization where I could try to make sense of what was happening. I threw some clothes and essentials into a bag, grabbed the journal and revolver, and headed for my car. But as I turned the key in the ignition, my heart sank. The engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it was no use. The battery was dead. I was trapped. With my car out of commission, I found myself in a predicament I never could have imagined when I first moved to this remote cabin. The creature I had seen the night before, the thing that logic told me couldn't possibly exist, was out there somewhere in the forest, and I had no way to escape. I spent the morning trying to get my car started, but it was no use. The battery was completely dead, and I didn't have the tools or knowledge to fix it. As the day wore on, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. It was mid-afternoon when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. My heart leapt with both hope and fear. Could it be help? Or was it someone or something more sinister? A battered pickup truck came into view, crunching over the gravel driveway. An older man, probably in his 60s, stepped out. He was tall and lean, with weathered skin that spoke of a life spent out. The older man approached cautiously, his eyes darting between me and the surrounding forest. As he got closer, I could see the lines of worry etched deep into his face. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said gruffly. "Name's Hank Townsend. I'm the local game warden." I introduced myself, relief washing over me at the sight of another human being. "I'm having car trouble," I explained. "The battery's dead." Hank nodded, his expression grim. "That's not your only problem, son. There's been incidents in these woods lately. People gone missing, strange sightings." My blood ran cold. "What kind of sightings?" Hank hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Things that don't make sense, things that shouldn't exist." I made a split-second decision. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out Mavis Abernathy's journal. "Like this?" I asked, holding it out to him. Hank's eyes widened as he took the journal, flipping through its pages. "Where did you find this?" he demanded. I told him everything, about discovering the abandoned campsite, finding the journal and revolver, and the terrifying encounter I'd had the night before. As I spoke, Hank's face grew increasingly pale. "I was afraid of this," he muttered. "It's happening again." "What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Hank sighed heavily. "It's a long story, and you're not going to like it, but you need to know." He gestured towards my cabin. "Let's go inside. It's not safe out here." Once inside, Hank insisted on checking all the windows and doors, making sure they were securely locked. Then he sat down at my kitchen table, the journal open in front of him. "I've lived in these parts my whole life," he began, "and there have always been stories, legends passed down by the indigenous people who lived here long before us. They spoke of a creature called the Wendigo, a spirit of hunger and winter that could possess humans, turning them into monstrous cannibals." I nodded, remembering the entry in Mavis's journal that mentioned the Wendigo. "Most folks treated it as just a scary story," Hank continued, "something to tell around the campfire. But every few decades, strange things would happen. People would go missing in the woods. There'd be sightings of something. Not quite human, not quite animal. He tapped the journal. Mavis Abernathy wasn't the first to document these occurrences. There have been others over the years. But most of the time, the evidence disappears. People who see something either leave and never come back, or they don't leave at all. A chill ran down my spine. So you're saying this Wendigo thing is real? Hank shrugged. I'm saying there's something out there that defies explanation. Whether it's the Wendigo of legend or something else entirely, I can't say. But it's dangerous, and it's active again. What do we do? I asked, fear and determination warring within me. First things first, we need to get you out of here, Hank said firmly. It's not safe for you to stay in this cabin alone. I've got some jumper cables in my truck. We'll get your car started and you can follow me back to town. As Hank stood up, a loud crack echoed from outside, the sound of a branch breaking under a heavy weight. We both froze, eyes locked on the window. For a moment, everything was silent. Then we heard it, a low guttural growl that was unmistakably inhuman. It's here, Hank whispered, his face ashen. God help us, it's here. The growl outside grew louder, more insistent. I could hear heavy footsteps circling the cabin, the wooden porch creaking under significant weight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Hank moved swiftly, his earlier caution replaced by decisive action. He pulled the revolver from his belt, checking to make sure it was loaded. Get away from the windows, he hissed, motioning me towards the center of the room. I complied, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. What is it? I whispered, though deep down I already knew the answer. The thing you saw last night, Hank replied grimly. The Wendigo, or whatever the hell it really is. A loud thump against the side of the cabin made us both jump. It sounded like something large had thrown itself against the wall. The windows rattled in their frames and I feared they might shatter at any moment. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice shaking. Make a run for your truck. Hank shook his head. That's exactly what it wants. It's faster than us, stronger than us. Our only chance is to wait it out, hope it loses interest. Another impact shook the cabin, this one even stronger than the last. A spiderweb of cracks appeared in one of the windows. And if it doesn't lose interest? I asked, already dreading the answer. Hank's grip tightened on his revolver. Then we fight. The next few hours were the longest of my life. The creature outside continued its assault on the cabin, sometimes battering against the walls, other times trying to force its way through the door or windows. All the while it made those terrible sounds, growls and moans that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Hank and I took turns watching, one of us always on guard while the other tried to rest. But sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gaunt, horrifying face I had glimpsed the night before. As dawn approached, the attacks began to lessen in frequency and intensity. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, silence had fallen over the forest once more. Hank and I looked at each other, both of us haggard and exhausted. Is it over? I asked hesitantly. For now, Hank replied, but his tone was far from relieved. It'll be back. They always come back. We cautiously made our way outside, surveying the damage to the cabin. Deep gouges marred the wooden walls, and one of the windows was cracked but miraculously unbroken. But it was what we found on the porch that truly chilled me to the bone. There, scratched deep into the wood, was a crude symbol, a stick figure with exaggerated limbs and a grotesquely elongated head. Below it was a single word, hungry. Hank's face went pale as he saw the marking. We need to leave, he said urgently, now, before it comes back. We wasted no time. Hank helped me jump-start my car, and within minutes we were speeding down the dirt road that led away from my cabin and towards the town of Tallwood. As we drove, Hank filled me in on more details. The attacks, he explained, tended to come in cycles. Every few decades, something would stir in the deep woods, and the disappearances would begin again. The local authorities tried to keep it quiet, not wanting to start a panic or drive away the tourists that the town relied on. But this time feels different, Hank admitted. More intense, like it's building up to something big. I thought about the journal, about Mavis Abernathy and all the others who had encountered this thing over the years. What are we going to do? I asked, Hank was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resolve. "We're going to do what should have been done a long time ago," he said. "We're going to end this once and for all." As we drove into Tallwood, the weight of what lay ahead settled over us like a shroud. Whatever this creature was, Wendigo, monster, or something else entirely, it had terrorized these woods for far too long. It was time to put a stop to it. But as I looked back at the dark line of trees receding behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Tallwood was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. As Hank and I drove down the main street, I could feel curious eyes watching us from behind curtained windows and storefront displays. News traveled fast in a town like this, and I had no doubt that word of our harrowing night had already spread. Hank pulled up in front of a modest two-story building with a sign that read, "Tallwood Sheriff's Department." As we got out of our vehicles, a stocky man with a salt and pepper mustache emerged from the building, his face set in a grim expression. "Hank," he nodded, then turned his attention to me. "You must be Mr. McDougal. I'm Sheriff Lowell Erickson. I understand you've had quite the experience." I shook the sheriff's hand, noticing the tension in his grip. "That's putting it mildly," I replied. Sheriff Erickson ushered us inside, leading us to a small conference room at the back of the building. As we sat down, I couldn't help but notice the way the sheriff's eyes kept darting to the windows, as if expecting to see something lurking outside. "All right," he said once we were all seated. "I need you to tell me everything. Don't leave out a single detail." For the next hour, I recounted my experiences, finding the journal, the nighttime visitor, and the siege on my cabin. Hank chimed in occasionally, adding his own observations. Throughout it all, Sheriff Erickson listened intently, his frown deepening with each passing minute. When we finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "I was afraid of this," he muttered. "It's starting again." "You knew about this?" I asked, unable to keep the accusation out of my voice. "Why hasn't anything been done?" Sheriff Erickson's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and guilt. "You think we haven't tried? Every time this thing surfaces, we do our best to track it, to stop it, but it's always one step ahead of us. And the few times we've gotten close..." He trailed off, his gaze distant. "What?" I pressed. "What happened?" The sheriff sighed heavily. "We lost good people, deputies, trackers, even a state police detachment once. This thing, whatever it is, it's not just some animal. It's smart, and it's deadly." Hank leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "But this time is different, Lowell. You've seen the reports. More sightings, more missing persons. It's escalating." Sheriff Erickson nodded grimly. "I know, that's why I've called in some help." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. A woman entered, her posture radiating authority despite her small stature. She was in her late 40s, with short graying hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Gentlemen," the sheriff said, "this is Dr. Eleanor Blackwood. She's an anthropologist specializing in cryptozoology and folklore. The state sent her to help us make sense of what's happening." Dr. Blackwood nodded to each of us in turn. "I've been studying the legends of this region for years," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "The stories of the Wendigo are particularly prevalent here, more so than in many other parts of the country." "So you believe it's real?" I asked, still struggling to reconcile what I had seen with what I had always believed possible. Dr. Blackwood's lips quirked in a humorless smile. "Mr. McDougal, in my line of work, I've learned that real is a very flexible concept. What I believe is that something is stalking these woods, something that has inspired fear and legend for generations. Whether it's truly the Wendigo of Algonquin legend or something else entirely, that's what we're here to find out." She pulled out a laptop and began setting it up on the conference table. "I've been compiling data on sightings, disappearances, and other unusual occurrences in this area going back over a century. When we map it all out, a pattern emerges." As Dr. Blackwood pulled up a map on her computer, my eyes were drawn to the scattered red dots that marked incidents across the region. They seemed to cluster around certain areas, with my cabin sitting ominously close to one of the largest concentrations. "These clusters represent areas of high activity," Dr. Blackwood explained. places where the boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond seems to be thinner. Sheriff Erickson leaned in, studying the map intently. So what do we do? How do we stop this thing? Dr. Blackwood's expression turned grim. That's the tricky part. Traditional lore suggests that Wendigos can be killed by fire or by destroying the heart. But we're dealing with something that may only be inspired by those legends, not bound by them. We need to draw it out, Hank said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. Set a trap. Use bait to lure it somewhere we can control the situation. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what Hank was suggesting. You want to use someone as bait? That's insane. But even as I protested, I could see the wheels turning in the others' minds. They were considering it. It may be our only chance, Dr. Blackwood said softly. If we don't stop this thing now, more people will die. The cycle will continue. I looked around the room, at the determined faces of these people who had been fighting this battle long before I arrived in Tallwood. I thought of Mavis Abernathy, of all the others who had encountered this creature over the years, and I made a decision that would change my life forever. I'll do it, I heard myself say. I'll be the bait. The room fell silent as everyone turned to stare at me. I could see the mixture of surprise, respect, and concern in their eyes. But there was something else too. A glimmer of hope. For the first time, they had a chance to end this nightmare once and for all. As we began to plan our dangerous mission, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a role I could never have imagined for myself. The quiet, divorced tech salesman who had come to these woods, seeking peace, was gone. In his place stood a man willing to risk everything to protect others from the terror that lurked in the shadows. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the room. Soon darkness would fall over Tallwood once again, and somewhere out there in the depths of the forest, the creature waited, hungry, patient, ready for the hunt to begin anew. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as we prepared for our desperate plan. Dr. Blackwood took charge, coordinating our efforts with a mix of scientific precision and grim determination. She had faced similar situations before, she told us, though never quite on this scale. The key, she explained as we gathered around a large map spread out on the sheriff's conference table, is to create a controlled environment. We need to limit the creature's options, funnel it where we want it to go. Sheriff Erickson pointed to a location on the map, a small clearing about 5 miles from my cabin. There's an old fire watchtower here, he said. It's been abandoned for years, but it's still structurally sound. High ground, good visibility. Could be a good spot for our trap. Dr. Blackwood nodded approvingly. Perfect. We'll set up a perimeter around the tower, cameras and motion sensors to track the creature's approach. Mr. McDougal will be inside the tower itself, protected but still visible enough to act as bait. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the knot of fear in my stomach. And then what? How do we actually stop this thing? Fire, Hank said grimly, hefting a large flamethrower he had procured from God knows where. If the legends are right, it's our best bet. Dr. Blackwood pulled out a small case and opened it, revealing several syringes filled with a pale blue liquid. And if fire doesn't work, we have these. It's a powerful sedative strong enough to take down an elephant. If we can get close enough to inject the creature, it should incapacitate it long enough for us to deal with it permanently. I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. The plan seemed solid enough on paper, but I couldn't shake the memory of those inhuman eyes, that grotesque face leering at me from the darkness. Would any plan be enough against something like that? As the others continued to discuss strategy, I slipped outside for some air. The town of Tallwood seemed eerily quiet, its residents no doubt aware that something was happening but unsure of exactly what. As I stood there trying to calm my nerves, I felt a presence beside me. It was Dr. Blackwood, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and determination. "Having second thoughts?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "No, just processing it all, I guess. A week ago, my biggest worry was whether I'd unpacked all my boxes. Now I'm getting ready to face off against a monster straight out of legend." Dr. Blackwood placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Fear is natural, Mr. McDougal. It's what we do in the face of that fear that defines us. You're braver than you know." Her words bolstered my resolve. As we headed back inside to finalize our plans, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Whatever happened in the coming days, I knew I was doing the right thing. The day of our mission dawned cold and misty, the forest shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to muffle all sound. Our small team, myself, Dr. Blackwood, Hank, Sheriff Erickson, and 2 of his most trusted deputies, made our way quietly through the woods towards the old fire watchtower. As we approached the clearing, I could see the tower looming above us, its weathered frame a stark silhouette against the gray sky. The others quickly set about establishing our perimeter, setting up cameras and motion sensors in a wide circle around the tower. Dr. Blackwood pulled me aside as the others worked. "Remember," she said, her voice low and urgent, "your job is to draw it in, make noise, move around, do whatever you need to do to get its attention, but do not, under any circumstances, leave the tower. No matter what you hear or see, stay inside until we give the all clear. Understood?" I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. As the final preparations were made, I climbed the rickety stairs to the top of the tower. The small room at the top was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but it offered a 360-degree view of the surrounding forest. I could see the others taking up their positions in the trees around the clearing. Hank with his flamethrower, the others armed with tranquilizer rifles loaded with Dr. Blackwood's special sedative. And then we waited. Hours passed with no sign of the creature. I paced the small confines of the tower room, occasionally shouting or making noise as Dr. Blackwood had instructed. As night fell, the forest came alive with the usual sounds of nocturnal animals. But underneath it all, there was a tension, a sense of wrongness that set my nerves on edge. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I rushed to the windows, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then movement caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, something huge and pale was moving through the trees. It was the creature, the Wendigo, and it was heading straight for the tower. "It's here!" I shouted into the radio Dr. Blackwood had given me, coming from the north side. I could hear the others scrambling to position themselves, but my attention was fixed on the approaching monster. As it entered the clearing, I got my first clear look at it in the moonlight. It was even more terrifying than I remembered, impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tight over protruding bones. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core, a twisted, almost human visage with sunken eyes that glowed with an unnatural hunger. The creature paused at the base of the tower, its head tilted as if listening. Then, with a speed that belied its awkward appearance, it began to climb. "It's coming up the tower," I yelled into the radio, backing away from the windows in terror. I could hear shouting from outside, saw flashes of light as the others opened fire with their tranquilizer rifles. But the darts seemed to have little effect on the creature. It continued its ascent, those terrible claws leaving deep gouges in the wood of the tower. Just as the creature reached the top, a jet of flame erupted from the tree line. Hank had opened fire with the flamethrower. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound of pain and rage that sent shivers down my spine, and leapt from the tower, its body wreathed in flames. For a moment I dared to hope that it was over, but as the creature hit the ground it rolled, extinguishing the flames, and then with that same inhuman speed it charged towards Hank's position. What happened next was a blur of chaos and violence. I could hear screaming gunshots, the roar of the flamethrower. Through the windows of the tower I caught glimpses of the battle raging below, flashes of flame, the pale form of the Wendigo darting between the trees, the others trying desperately to bring it down. And then, silence fell over the clearing. For a long, terrible moment, I didn't know who had won. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way down the tower stairs. As I emerged into the clearing, I saw the others gathered around something on the ground. Drawing closer, I realized it was the Wendigo, or what was left of it. The creature's body was charred and riddled with tranquilizer darts, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. But even as we stood there, hardly daring to believe it was over, the creature's remains began to change. The burnt flesh seemed to melt away, revealing not bone but soil and roots. Within minutes, All that was left was a vaguely humanoid shape made of earth and plant matter. Dr. Blackwood knelt beside the remains, her face a mask of fascination and horror. "It's not a Wendigo," she murmured. "At least, not in the traditional sense. It's something older, a spirit of the forest itself, perhaps, corrupted by fear and hunger." As we stood there in the pre-dawn light, trying to process what we had witnessed, I felt a profound sense of change come over me. The world I had known, a world of logic and reason, had been irrevocably altered. There were things out there, ancient and powerful things, that defied explanation. In the days that followed, we did our best to cover up what had happened. The official story was that a dangerous animal had been put down, nothing more. But those of us who had been there that night knew the truth. We had faced something beyond our understanding and, against all odds, we had survived. As for me, I couldn't bring myself to return to my cabin in the woods. The peace and solitude I had sought there now seemed like a foolish dream. Instead, I found myself drawn to stay in Tallwood, to help Dr. Blackwood and the others prepare for the possibility that there might be more creatures out there, more threats lurking in the shadows of the world. The quiet, divorced tech salesman who had come to these woods seeking a fresh start was gone. In his place stood a man who had stared into the face of the impossible and lived to tell the tale. A man who now knew that the line between legend and reality was far thinner than he had ever imagined. And as I looked out at the forest surrounding Tallwood, I couldn't shake the feeling that our battle with the unknown was far from over. It was just beginning. This happened in 1983. My name is Jasper Whitlock, and I've always been drawn to the solitude of nature. As a 34-year-old freelance writer from Chicago, I often found myself yearning for an escape from the chaos of city life. That's why, in the summer of 1983, I decided to spend some time away in the serene wilderness of Arkansas. After some research, I settled on renting a small cabin nestled deep in the Ozark National Forest, just outside of Eureka Springs. The drive from Chicago was long and tiring, but as I wound my way through the dense forest on increasingly narrow roads, I felt a sense of excitement building. The lush greenery seemed to envelop my car, creating a tunnel of vibrant emerald that stretched as far as the eye could see. Finally, after what felt like hours of navigating winding dirt roads, I arrived at my destination. The cabin was exactly as I had imagined it. A quaint, rustic structure made of weathered logs, with a small porch overlooking a clearing in the woods. As I stepped out of my car, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Gone were the constant honking horns and bustling crowds of Chicago. Here the only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. I spent the rest of that first day settling in and exploring my immediate surroundings. The cabin was sparsely furnished but comfortable, with a small kitchenette, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a loft bedroom accessible by a narrow ladder. Outside, a well-worn path led from the porch to a nearby creek, its waters clear and inviting. Eager to immerse myself in the wilderness experience, I decided to try my hand at fishing. I found an old rod in a closet and made my way down to the creek. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the water's surface. Despite my enthusiasm, my fishing attempts were less than successful. After an hour of fruitless casting, I resigned myself to the fact that I was no expert angler. As dusk began to fall, I made my way back to the cabin. The forest took on a different character in the fading light. Shadows lengthened and deepened, and unfamiliar sounds began to emerge from the undergrowth. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, causing me to quicken my pace. By the time I reached the safety of the cabin, I felt a strange unease settling over me. Shaking off the feeling, I set about making dinner. In the backyard, I found a fire pit ringed with stones. Gathering some kindling and larger branches, I managed to start a small fire. Over the crackling flames, I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and hot dogs. Not exactly gourmet fare, but satisfying nonetheless. As I sat by the fire, watching the embers glow and listening to the night sounds of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often I would catch a glimpse of movement just beyond the circle of firelight. or hear a rustle that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, my city-dweller mind unused to the ways of the wilderness. But as the night wore on and the shadows deepened, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more frequently. Finally, unable to shake my growing unease, I extinguished the fire and retreated to the relative safety of the cabin. Inside, I double-checked that all the windows and doors were securely locked before climbing up to the loft bedroom. As I lay in bed, staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, I could have sworn I heard something moving outside, circling the cabin. It was probably just a raccoon or some other nocturnal creature, I told myself. But sleep was long in coming that night, and when it did, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and glowing eyes in the darkness. The next morning, I awoke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. In the bright light of day, my fears from the previous night seemed silly and unfounded. I chided myself for letting my imagination run wild and resolved to make the most of my second day in the wilderness. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars on the porch, I was startled by a voice calling out from the edge of the clearing. "Well, good morning there, City Slicker." I looked up to see an elderly woman emerging from the tree line. She was small and wiry, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She introduced herself as Hester Blackburn, my nearest neighbor, though her cabin was a good mile away through the dense forest. "Noticed your fishing attempt yesterday," Hester said with a wry smile. "No one to hold them, no one to fold them, eh?" She chuckled at her own joke, referencing my failed attempts at catching fish. I laughed along, grateful for the company and the gentle ribbing. "I'm afraid I'm not much of an angler," I admitted. Hester's eyes softened. "Well, can't have you going hungry out here in the woods. Tell you what, I've got my late husband's old fishing rod gathering dust. Why don't you borrow it? Elijah always said it brought him luck." I accepted her offer gratefully, but couldn't help noticing the way Hester's voice caught slightly when she mentioned her husband. "Thank you, Hester. I really appreciate it. If you don't mind me asking, how long ago did your husband pass?" A shadow seemed to pass over Hester's face. "Oh, Elijah. He used to love coming out here, until one day he just vanished." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. "Vanished? What do you mean?" Hester sighed, her gaze drifting to the surrounding forest. "It was about 5 years ago now. Elijah went out for his usual morning walk and never came back. We searched for weeks, the police, volunteer groups, even brought in tracking dogs. But it was like he just disappeared into thin air." I felt a knot forming in the pit of my stomach. "I'm so sorry, Hester. That must have been terrible." She nodded, her eyes taking on a faraway look. "The worst part is Elijah wasn't the first. Over the years there have been others, hikers, campers, even a few locals. They go into these woods, and some of them just never come out." As Hester spoke, I couldn't help but recall my uneasy feelings from the previous night. The sense of being watched, the strange noises. Suddenly they didn't seem so easy to dismiss. "How many people are we talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Hester shrugged. "It's hard to say for sure. Some folks might have just moved on without telling anyone, but I'd reckon at least a dozen over the past 20 years or so. Enough that some of us who've lived here a long time, we know better than to go too deep into the forest alone." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "And no one knows what happened to them?" "There are theories, of course," Hester said. "Some say it's bears or mountain lions, though we ain't had a confirmed sighting of either in these parts for decades. Others talk about sinkholes or hidden caves. And then there are those who believe in other explanations." "What kind of other explanations?" I asked, not sure I wanted to hear the answer. Hester leaned in close, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are stories, old stories, passed down by the Cherokee who lived in these hills long before us. They speak of creatures that dwell in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, creatures that are neither man nor beast, but something in between." A chill ran down my spine as Hester spoke. I wanted to dismiss her words as nothing more than local folklore, the kind of spooky stories told around campfires. But there was something in her eyes, a haunted look that spoke of personal experience. "Now, I'm not saying I believe all that," Hester continued, straightening up. But I will say this, there are things in these woods that can't be easily explained. You'd do well to be careful out there, especially after dark. With that ominous warning, Hester bid me goodbye and disappeared back into the forest, leaving me with a borrowed fishing rod and a head full of troubling thoughts. As I watched her go, I couldn't shake the feeling that my peaceful retreat into nature had suddenly taken on a much darker tone. Despite Hester's unsettling tales, I was determined not to let fear ruin my vacation. I spent the rest of the morning exploring the area immediately around the cabin, always keeping it within sight. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with sunbeams filtering through the canopy and creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. I spotted various wildflowers, colorful birds, and even a family of deer grazing in a nearby clearing. As the day wore on, I decided to give Hester's fishing rod a try. I made my way down to the creek, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. The water burbled peacefully over smooth stones, and for a while I lost myself in the rhythmic casting and reeling. To my surprise and delight, I actually managed to catch a couple of small trout. As I cleaned my catch by the creek, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Here I was, a city boy, providing for myself in the wilderness. It was a good feeling, one that almost made me forget about the strange occurrences and unsettling stories. Almost. As the afternoon began to wane, I noticed the forest growing quieter. The birdsong that had been my constant companion throughout the day gradually faded away, replaced by an eerie stillness. The shadows began to lengthen, stretching like dark fingers across the forest floor. I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. As I gathered my things, I heard a twig snap somewhere in the underbrush behind me. I whirled around, my heart suddenly racing, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is someone there?" No response came, but I could have sworn I heard something moving through the brush, circling around me. I began to walk quickly back towards the cabin, my eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow seemed to hide some lurking presence. I picked up my pace, almost running now, my caught fish forgotten and left behind on the creek bank. Just as I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deep to be a wolf, too guttural for a bear. It was a sound that spoke of ancient primal hunger. I sprinted the last few yards to the cabin, slamming the door behind me and throwing the lock. For a long moment I stood there, my back pressed against the door, listening intently. But all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. As night fell, I paced the cabin, jumping at every creak of the old wooden structure and every whisper of wind outside. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that my imagination was running wild due to Hester's stories and the unfamiliar surroundings. But deep down, I knew that what I had heard out there was real, and it was unlike anything that should exist in these woods. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night huddled in a chair by the fireplace, Hester's fishing rod clutched in my hands like a weapon. Every so often I would hear something moving outside, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, branches snapping under significant weight. Once I could have sworn I saw a massive shadow pass by one of the windows, momentarily blotting out the moonlight. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the noises outside finally ceased. I waited another hour, hardly daring to breathe, before I finally worked up the courage to peer outside. The clearing around the cabin looked undisturbed. There were no massive footprints, no signs of the terror that had stalked the night. But as I stepped out onto the porch, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The wooden railing of the porch, thick logs as big around as my arm, had deep gouges in them, gouges that looked disturbingly like claw marks. Something had been trying to get in. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and fear. I barely left the cabin, venturing out only when absolutely necessary, and always returning well before dusk. I spent my time poring over local maps, searching for the quickest route back to civilization, and trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was somehow explainable. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something out there in those woods, something that defied rational explanation. I thought about Hester's stories of the missing people, of the creatures that were neither man nor beast. With each passing day, those tales seemed less like folklore and more like warnings that should have been heeded. On the 5th day of my stay, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore, jumping at every shadow and sound. I had to know the truth, had to face whatever was out there. And so, steeling my nerves, I resolved to venture deeper into the forest than I ever had before. I set out early in the morning, armed with nothing but Hester's fishing rod, a small backpack of supplies, and a desperately inadequate sense of courage. The forest seemed different now, more sinister. The very air felt heavy with menace, and every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. For hours I pushed deeper and deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy so thick that little sunlight penetrated. The ground became rougher, riddled with hidden roots and unexpected drops. More than once I nearly lost my footing on the treacherous terrain. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I had wandered far off any marked trail, and in my determination to uncover the truth, I had lost all sense of direction. Panic began to set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost in a forest that seemed to grow more menacing by the minute. Just as I was about to give in to despair, I spotted something through the trees, a clearing up ahead. Hope surged through me. Perhaps it was a campsite or even a ranger station. I quickened my pace, pushing through the undergrowth towards the open space. But as I burst into the clearing, my hope turned to ashes. It wasn't a campsite or a ranger station, it was a graveyard. Crude wooden crosses dotted the small clearing, each one marking a mound of earth. Some of the crosses were weathered and old, while others looked more recent. With growing horror, I realized I was looking at the final resting places of those who had vanished in these woods. I approached one of the newer-looking graves, my legs shaking beneath me. Carved into the cross was a name and a date. Elijah Blackburn, 1978. Hester's husband, the man who had vanished without a trace 5 years ago. Here was the proof of his fate, hidden deep in the forest where no search party had ever ventured. As the implications of what I was seeing began to sink in, I heard it, that same low rumbling growl that had haunted my nights. Only this time it was much closer. And it wasn't alone. I spun around, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the most terrifying sight I had ever beheld. It was a creature straight out of a nightmare, a monstrous amalgamation of bear and wolf, but far larger than either. Its body was covered in thick matted fur, and its limbs ended in massive paws tipped with wickedly curved claws. But it was the creature's face that truly froze the blood in my veins. Its muzzle was elongated like a wolf's, filled with rows of dagger-like teeth. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed with an unnatural, blood-red light, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. For a long moment we stared at each other across the clearing. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable even to breathe. The creature's muscles rippled beneath its fur as it tensed, preparing to spring. And then, with a roar that shook the very ground, it charged. In that moment, as the monstrous creature bore down upon me, time seemed to slow to a crawl. I could see every detail with horrifying clarity, the saliva dripping from its massive jaws, the earth torn up by its claws as it charged, the unholy light gleaming in its eyes. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, anything to escape. But my body remained frozen, paralyzed by a terror beyond anything I had ever known. It was only at the last possible second, as the beast's fetid breath washed over me, that my survival instinct finally kicked in. I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as the creature's massive form hurtled past me. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me, but I didn't have time to recover. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and ran. I plunged back into the forest, crashing through the underbrush with no thought of direction or stealth. Behind me, I could hear the creature's enraged roar and the sound of splintering wood as it pursued me. Trees whipped past in a blur, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, but I barely felt the pain. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and the monster at my heels. As I ran, my mind raced frantically. What was that thing? How could such a creature exist? The stories Hester had told me, the tales of beings that were neither man nor beast, suddenly seemed all too real. This was what had been stalking the woods for years, claiming victims and leaving their bodies in that hidden graveyard. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear the creature crashing through the forest behind me, drawing ever closer. Its growls and snarls filled the air, a symphony of primal hunger and rage. Suddenly the ground beneath my feet disappeared. In my blind panic, I had run right off the edge of a steep incline. I tumbled head over heels down the slope, bouncing off rocks and tree roots, unable to stop my descent. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, every part of my body screamed in pain. But I knew I couldn't stay there. Forcing myself to my feet, I looked around wildly for some means of escape. That's when I saw it, a narrow opening in the rock face nearby, a cave. Without thinking, I dove for the entrance, squeezing through the tight opening just as I heard the creature reach the top of the slope. Inside, the cave widened into a larger chamber. It was pitch black, but I pressed on, feeling my way along the rough stone walls, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the entrance as possible. Behind me, I could hear the creature's frustrated roars as it tried to force its massive bulk through the narrow cave opening. The sound echoed off the stone walls, amplified into a deafening cacophony that threatened to shatter my sanity. I don't know how long I stumbled through that dark cave system. Time lost all meaning in the pitch blackness. My world narrowed to the feel of the stone beneath my hands and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Every so often I would hear distant echoes of the creature's roars, spurring me to push on despite my exhaustion and pain. Eventually I felt a faint breeze on my face. Following it, I found myself emerging from the cave system into a small ravine. The sky above was turning purple with the approaching dawn. I had spent the entire night underground, but I wasn't safe yet. I knew the creature was still out there hunting me. And now I was even more lost than before, with no idea how to get back to the cabin or to any form of civilization. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the forest canopy, I forced my battered body into motion once again. I had to find help, had to warn others about the monster that lurked in these woods, and somehow I had to find a way to survive. The next few days blurred together in a haze of fear, exhaustion, and constant movement. I pushed myself to keep going, knowing that to stop meant certain death. The forest seemed to have transformed into an endless maze, each tree indistinguishable from the last. I survived on whatever I could forage, berries, roots, and the occasional fish I managed to catch with my bare hands in the small streams I encountered. But worse than the physical hardships was the constant gnawing fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I knew the creature was out there, hunting me. Sometimes in the dead of night, I would hear its distant howls, a chilling reminder that I was not alone in these woods. On what I estimated to be the fourth day since my encounter in the graveyard, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown logging road. Hope surged through me at this sign of human presence, no matter how old. I followed the road, praying it would lead me back to civilization. As the sun began to set, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees ahead. Drawing closer, I saw it was a small cabin, not unlike the one I had rented. Smoke rose from its chimney, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. I approached cautiously, my recent experiences having taught me to be wary. As I neared the cabin, the door suddenly flew open. An old man emerged, a shotgun leveled at my chest. "That's far enough, stranger," he called out, his voice gruff and suspicious. "State your business." I raised my hand slowly, aware of how I must look, clothes torn and filthy, covered in cuts and bruises, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. "Please," I croaked, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I need help. There's something out there in the woods." The old man's eyes narrowed, but after a moment he lowered his shotgun slightly. "You've seen it, haven't you? The beast?" I nodded, relief washing over me at being believed. What is it?" The old man sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older. "Come inside," he said. "It ain't safe out here after dark. I'll tell you what I know." Inside the cabin, the old man introduced himself as Jeremiah Holt. He had lived in these woods for over 50 years, he told me, and had seen things that defied explanation. As we sat by his fire eating a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Jeremiah shared his knowledge. "The creature you saw," he began, his voice low and grave, "it's been here longer than any of us. The Cherokee called it the Nunahai, the Immortals. They believed it to be a spirit that could take physical form, a guardian of the forest, but something changed." Jeremiah went on to explain that as white settlers moved into the area, bringing with them destruction and exploitation of the land, the Nunahai had grown angry and vengeful. It began to attack those who ventured too deep into its domain, no longer distinguishing between those who meant harm and those who were innocent. "But why the graveyard?" I asked, remembering the clearing filled with crude crosses. Jeremiah's face darkened. "That's the work of its followers," he said. "Over the years, some folks who've encountered the beast, well, it does something to their minds. They start to worship it, bring it offerings. Those graves, their sacrifices." The implications of what Jeremiah was saying chilled me to my core. Not only was there a monstrous creature stalking these woods, but there were people actively aiding it, treating it as some kind of dark god. I thought of Hester and her stories, wondering if she knew more than she had let on. "How do we stop it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jeremiah shook his head slowly. "Stop it? Son, people have been trying to stop it for generations. Hunters, rangers, even a team of so-called paranormal experts once. None of them ever came back." He paused, taking a long drink from a mason jar filled with what I assumed was moonshine. "Best thing we can do is stay out of its way. Stick to the edges of the forest, don't go too deep. And whatever you do, never go out alone after dark." I spent that night in Jeremiah's cabin, grateful for the relative safety and human company. But sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red orbs, heard that bone-chilling growl, and underneath it all was a growing sense of anger and frustration. How many more people would fall victim to this creature? How long would these woods be haunted by its presence? As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't simply walk away, couldn't live with myself knowing what was out there and doing nothing about it. I had to find a way to end this, to stop the creature once and for all. Jeremiah tried to talk me out of it, pleading with me to just go home and forget what I'd seen. But my mind was made up. He finally relented, realizing he couldn't dissuade me, and instead offered what help he could. From a locked chest, he retrieved an old revolver. "It belonged to my grandfather," he said, pressing it into my hands. "The bullets are silver. Don't know if that'll make a difference, but it can't hurt." He also gave me a map of the area, marking the locations where the creature had been most frequently sighted. And finally, he shared a piece of lore that had been passed down through generations. "There's a cave deep in the heart of the forest," Jeremiah said. "The old stories say it's the creature's lair, the source of its power. If there's any hope of stopping it, that's where you'll find it." Armed with Jeremiah's gifts and whatever courage I could muster, I set out at first light. The map led me deeper into the forest than I had ever been before. The trees here were ancient, their massive trunks twisting up into a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was heavy and still, filled with a palpable sense of menace. As I pushed on, I began to notice strange markings on the trees, crude symbols carved into the bark. Some looked like stylized representations of the creature, while others were more abstract, spiraling patterns that made my head spin if I looked at them too long. I realized I was seeing signs of the creature's followers, markers to guide them to their dark god. The day wore on, and I knew I was getting close to the cave Jeremiah had spoken of. The sense of wrongness in the air grew stronger with each step. Small animals darted away as I approached, and even the birds had gone silent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. And then, as the last light of day was fading, I saw it. The cave mouth loomed before me, a jagged tear in the side of a hill. The entrance was surrounded by more of those unsettling symbols, and bones, animal and human, were scattered on the ground before it. I stood at the threshold, the weight of what I was about to do settling over me. I was no hero, no monster hunter. I was just a writer who had stumbled into something far bigger and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. But I knew I couldn't turn back now. Whatever waited for me in the depths of that cave, I had to face it. With a deep breath, I flicked on my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. The cave was a nightmare made manifest. The beam of my flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness, barely illuminating a few feet in front of me. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something older and far more malevolent. As I ventured deeper, the cave walls began to change. What started as natural rock formations gradually gave way to crude carvings, pictographs depicting scenes of violence and terror. I saw representations of the creature in various forms, sometimes more bear-like, sometimes more wolf-like, but always monstrous. And scattered among these images were human figures, bowing in worship or being torn apart in gruesome detail. The carvings seemed to move in the flickering light of my flashlight, creating an illusion of animation that sent shivers down my spine. I pressed on, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that threatened to overwhelm me. The tunnel I was following began to slope downward, leading me deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, and I could hear the faint sound of running water echoing from somewhere ahead. As I rounded a bend in the passage, I emerged into a vast underground chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the ceiling, lost in the darkness above, but what I could see was enough to stop me in my tracks. The chamber was dominated by a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark with what I could only assume was blood. Surrounding the altar were dozens of stone pillars, each carved with more of those dizzying, spiraling symbols. And there, arranged in a semicircle around the altar, were the creature's followers. They wore tattered robes adorned with bones and feathers, their faces hidden behind crude masks made from animal skulls. They stood perfectly still as if waiting for something. I ducked behind one of the pillars, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. For a long moment nothing happened. Then from somewhere in the darkness beyond the altar came a sound that made my blood run cold, the low, rumbling growl of the creature. It emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given flesh. In the confined space of the cave it seemed even larger than before. Its red eyes swept the chamber, and I pressed myself harder against the pillar, praying it wouldn't see me. The followers began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, their voices rising and falling in an unsettling rhythm. The creature approached the altar, and to my horror, I saw that it was dragging something. No, someone. It was a young woman, her clothes torn and bloody, her eyes wide with terror. She struggled weakly against the creature's grip, but it was clear she had no chance of escaping. With a casual brutality that turned my stomach, the creature lifted her onto the altar. I knew I had to act. Whatever was about to happen, I couldn't stand by and watch. My hand tightened around Jeremiah's revolver as I steeled myself for what I was about to do. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out from behind the pillar and raised the gun. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the cave walls. The chanting cut off abruptly. Every head in the chamber turned towards me, including the creature's. Its red eyes locked onto mine, filled with a hatred so intense it was almost palpable. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, with a roar that shook dust from the ceiling, the creature charged. I fired, the report of the revolver deafening in the enclosed space. The silver bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, and to my amazement, it actually stumbled. Black ichor oozed from the wound, and the beast let out a howl of pain and rage. But my brief moment of triumph was short-lived. The creature's followers, shaking off their initial shock, began to advance on me. I fired again, taking down one of the masked figures, but there were too many. They swarmed over me, their hands clawing and grasping. I fought with everything I had, but I was outnumbered and exhausted. As I went down under a pile of writhing bodies, I saw the creature recovering, its red eyes fixed on me with murderous intent. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die, torn apart in a dark cave by a monster and its crazed worshippers. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, there was a deafening explosion, and suddenly the weight on top of me was gone. I opened my eyes to see the cave filled with smoke and confusion. A figure emerged from the haze, shotgun in hand. It was Jeremiah. "Come on, son," he shouted, extending a hand to pull me up. "We ain't got much time." As I staggered to my feet, I saw that Jeremiah wasn't alone. A group of people, armed with various weapons, were engaged in battle with the creature's followers. And there, Being helped away from the altar by two of the newcomers was the young woman who had nearly been sacrificed. "Who?" I began, but Jeremiah cut me off. "Later," he said grimly. "Right now we need to end this." He pressed something into my hand, a stick of dynamite, its fuse already lit. "The pillars," he said. "They're the key. Bring this whole damn place down on its head." I nodded, understanding. As Jeremiah provided covering fire, I ran towards the nearest pillar. The creature, recovering from the initial shock of the assault, let out a furious roar and began to give chase. Time seemed to slow as I reached the pillar. I could feel the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck as I wedged the dynamite into a crack in the stone. Then I was running again, diving for cover as the fuse burned down. The explosion was enormous, far larger than I expected. The pillar shattered, and with a grinding roar the ceiling began to collapse. Massive chunks of rock rained down, crushing cultists and narrowly missing our group as we made a desperate dash for the exit. I risked a glance back and saw the creature half buried under fallen rocks, its red eyes glaring at me with a hatred that transcended the physical. Then another section of the ceiling came down, and it was lost from view. We ran through the collapsing tunnel, dodging falling rocks and choking on dust. Behind us, the roar of the cave-in was deafening. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we burst out into the open air. We didn't stop running until we were well clear of the cave entrance. As we watched, the entire hillside seemed to shudder and sink, as if the earth itself was swallowing up the creature's lair. As the dust settled and the last echoes of the collapse faded away, I turned to Jeremiah, my mind reeling with questions. But before I could speak, he put a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, son," he said, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and sadness. "But this fight ain't over, not by a long shot." I looked around at the group that had come to our rescue, men and women of various ages, all with the same hardened look in their eyes. I realized I was looking at a group of survivors, people who had encountered the creature or its cult, and lived to tell the tale. As the adrenaline of the fight began to fade, I felt the weight of everything I had experienced settling over me. I knew that my life would never be the same, that I could never unsee or unknow the horrors I had witnessed in these woods, but I also knew that I had found a new purpose. Whatever it took, however long it took, I would see this through. The creature might not be dead, its cult might not be fully destroyed, but we had struck a significant blow, and next time we would be ready. In the years that followed, I dedicated myself to the fight against the creature and its cult. The group I had encountered that night became my new family, a brotherhood forged in shared trauma and common purpose. We scoured the forests, hunting down the remaining cultists and destroying their hidden shrines. We researched tirelessly, seeking any scrap of lore or knowledge that might give us an edge in our fight. And always we remained vigilant, knowing that somewhere out there the creature was still alive, nursing its hatred and biding its time. There were losses along the way, good people who fell victim to the darkness we fought against. But there were victories too. We saved lives, protected innocents who would have otherwise fallen prey to the horrors lurking in the deep woods. As for me, I never returned to my old life in Chicago. How could I, knowing what I knew? Instead, I made my home in a small cabin on the edge of the forest, always ready, always watching. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls through the trees, I think I can hear a distant, familiar growl, and I know that our fight is far from over. But I also know that as long as there are those willing to stand against the darkness, there is hope. The woods may be dark and full of terrors, but we are the light that keeps them at bay. And one day we will see the dawn of a world free from the shadow of the beast. Until then, we watch, we wait, and we fight on. This happened in the 1980s. It was 1983 to be exact. The summer air hung heavy with an oppressive heat that seemed to seep into every corner of the small Oregon town I called home. My name is John Hawthorne, and at 37 years old, I found myself seeking refuge from a turbulent past in a modest cabin nestled deep within the lush forests surrounding the area. Little did I know that the peace I sought would be shattered by a series of events that would forever change my life and the lives of those around me. As I sat on the worn wooden porch of my cabin, the gentle creaking of the rocking chair beneath me provided a soothing counterpoint to the cacophony of forest sounds. Birdsong filtered through the canopy of towering pines, while the distant gurgle of a nearby stream added its voice to the natural symphony. It was a far cry from the chaos I'd left behind in the city, and for the first time in years I felt a sense of calm washing over me. My days had fallen into a comfortable routine. I'd wake with the sun, brew a strong pot of coffee, and spend the morning tending to my small vegetable garden. The act of nurturing life from the rich, dark soil was therapeutic, a tangible reminder that growth and renewal were possible even after the darkest of times. In the afternoons, I'd often lose myself in long walks through the woods, marveling at the intricate beauty of the forest ecosystem. It was during one of these peaceful afternoons that I first noticed something amiss. As I approached my garden, a sense of unease crept over me. The neat rows of plants I'd so carefully tended were in disarray, leaves torn and stems crushed. At first I assumed it was the work of deer, or perhaps a particularly bold raccoon. But as I surveyed the damage more closely, a chill ran down my spine. The destruction was too thorough, too deliberate to be the work of any ordinary forest creature. Curious and unsettled, I found myself following a trail of broken vegetation leading away from the garden. The forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each step, the friendly whisper of leaves giving way to an eerie silence. As I pushed through a thick tangle of underbrush, I stumbled into a small clearing and felt my breath catch in my throat. Before me lay a scene of carnage that defied explanation. The mangled remains of small animals were strewn about, their bodies twisted and torn in ways that spoke of a savagery beyond anything I'd ever encountered. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air, mingling with a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. This was no ordinary predator's kill site. Whatever had done this was operating on a level of brutality that sent ice through my veins. With trembling hands, I knelt to examine the nearest carcass, fighting back the urge to retch. The wounds were unlike anything I'd seen before. Not the clean cuts of a hunter's knife or the precise bites of a wolf. These were ragged, almost frenzied, as if whatever had attacked these creatures had been driven by an insatiable bloodlust. As I stood, my eyes were drawn to a series of indistinct tracks leading away from the gruesome scene. They didn't match any animal prints I was familiar with, and their size alone was cause for alarm. Whatever had left these marks was large, far larger than any known predator in these parts. With growing trepidation, I followed the tracks, my heart pounding in my chest as they led me deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig and rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge, my imagination conjuring terrifying images of what might be lurking just out of sight. After what felt like an eternity, the tracks led me to the mouth of a cave, half hidden by a thick curtain of vines and moss. The entrance yawned before me, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow all light. The sickly sweet odor I'd noticed earlier was stronger here, wafting from the depths of the cave in nauseating waves. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee to the safety of my cabin and forget what I'd seen. But a morbid curiosity, coupled with a sense of responsibility to uncover the truth, propelled me forward. Steeling my nerves, I took a hesitant step toward the cave entrance. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Slowly, I turned my gaze to the depths of the cave, and what I saw in that moment would haunt me for the rest of my days. Emerging from the shadows was a creature that defied description. It moved on all fours, its massive body covered in matted fur caked with dried blood and bits of flesh. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, intelligent, calculating, and filled with a malevolence that was all too human. This was no ordinary animal. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in our world. As it bared its teeth, each fang the length of my finger, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't just a predator. It was a monster, a nightmare made flesh. And as it fixed its gaze upon me, I knew with horrifying certainty that I was its next intended prey. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The creature and I locked eyes, neither of us moving a muscle. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but I knew that any sudden movement would likely trigger an attack. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I began to back away. The creature's eyes followed my every move, its massive head swaying slightly as if weighing its options. I held my breath, praying to whatever higher power might be listening that it would let me go. As I reached the edge of the clearing, still facing the cave, the creature let out another bone-chilling growl. But to my immense relief, it made no move to pursue me. Taking this as my cue, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon, branches whipping at my face and arms as I fled. I didn't stop running until I burst through the door of my cabin, slamming it shut behind me and collapsing against it, gasping for air. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full weight of what I'd just witnessed came crashing down upon me. I trembled uncontrollably, my mind reeling as it tried to make sense of the impossible. As night fell, I huddled in my cabin, every creak and groan of the old wooden structure setting my nerves on edge. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, I found myself poring over old books and local folklore, desperate for any information that might shed light on what I'd encountered. It was in one of these dusty tomes that I came across a legend that chilled me to the bone. The book spoke of an ancient creature, part wolf and part bear, that was said to dwell in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. The local indigenous people had stories of it stretching back generations, tales of a beast that was more than just an animal. It was a force of nature, a manifestation of the forest's wildest and most primal essence. As I read on, the pieces began to fall into place. The creature's intelligence, its calculated behavior, the way it had seemed to be assessing me, it all aligned with the legends. But how could such a thing exist in the modern world, undetected for so long? I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The threat to the community was too great. But who would believe such an outlandish tale? I needed proof, and more importantly, I needed help. That's when I thought of Frank Peabody, the groundskeeper of a neighboring property. Frank had lived in these parts for decades and knew the forest better than anyone. If there was someone who might believe me and be willing to help, it was him. With the first light of dawn, I set out for Frank's place, the events of the previous day replaying in my mind with vivid clarity. As I approached his modest home, I saw him out front, tending to his own garden. The normalcy of the scene was almost jarring after the horrors I'd witnessed. "Morning, John," Frank called out as I approached. "You're out and about early. Everything all right?" I must have looked a sight wild-eyed, disheveled, and clearly on edge. Frank's friendly smile faded as he took in my appearance, concern etching lines into his weathered face. "Frank," I began, my voice hoarse, "I need your help. Something's out there in the woods, something dangerous." Over the next hour, I recounted everything I'd seen and experienced. To his credit, Frank listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant as if looking into the past. "You know," he said finally, "my granddaddy used to tell stories about something like what you're describing. Most folks wrote 'em off as tall tales, but he swore up and down they were true." Relief washed over me. He believed me, or at least he was willing to consider the possibility. "What do we do, Frank?" I asked, the weight of the situation bearing down on me once more. Frank's eyes hardened with determination. "First things first, we need to see this for ourselves. If there's really something out there, we need to know what we're dealing with. Then we can figure out how to protect the town." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Frank and I set out towards the cave. We were armed with old hunting rifles from Frank's shed, flashlights, and a determination born of necessity. The forest seemed different now, no longer a place of peace and natural beauty, but a realm of shadows and hidden dangers. The trek to the cave was tense, every snapping twig and rustling leaf setting our nerves on edge. As we neared the clearing where I'd first encountered the creature, the sickly sweet smell once again assaulted our senses. Frank's face paled, and I knew he was beginning to truly understand the gravity of the situation. Dear God, he whispered as we entered the clearing, taking in the scattered remains and the yawning mouth of the cave. We approached the entrance cautiously, our flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. The cave air was cold and damp, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of death. As we ventured deeper, the walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness becoming almost tangible. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the cavern, causing us both to freeze in our tracks. In the beam of our flashlights, we caught glimpses of movement, a massive shape shifting in the shadows, eyes gleaming with an unnatural intelligence. "John," Frank's voice was barely a whisper, "we need to get out of here, now." But it was too late. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the cave, the creature lunged from the darkness. In the chaos that followed, I heard the crack of our rifles, saw the muzzle flashes illuminate the beast's terrifying visage for split seconds at a time. But the bullets seemed to have no effect. I watched in horror as the creature seized Frank in its massive jaws, his scream of terror cut short as it dragged him deeper into the cave. I fired again and again, but in the confusion and darkness, I couldn't be sure if any of my shots found their mark. Panic overtook me and I fled, stumbling and scrambling towards the cave entrance. Frank's cries echoed behind me, growing fainter with each passing second. As I burst out into the night air, guilt and shame warred with relief and terror in my heart. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice was a lifeline in the midst of the nightmare I found myself in. I babbled out our location and a fragmented account of what had happened, pleading for them to send help immediately. As I waited for the authorities to arrive, I paced at the edge of the clearing, my eyes fixed on the cave entrance. Part of me wanted to go back in, to try and save Frank. But I knew it would be suicide. Whatever that thing was, it was beyond my ability to handle alone. The arrival of the police was heralded by the wail of sirens and the harsh glare of floodlights cutting through the forest gloom. A team of heavily armed officers approached, their faces grim as I recounted what had transpired. They looked skeptical at first, but the evidence of violence in the clearing and the unmistakable stench emanating from the cave lent credence to my story. As the search team entered the cave, I waited outside, my heart in my throat. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a shout came from within the cave. They had found something. Steeling myself, I followed the officers back into the cavern. In a small chamber off the main tunnel, illuminated by the harsh glare of police floodlights, lay Frank's body. The sight was gruesome beyond description, and I had to turn away, fighting back the urge to be sick. The creature itself was nowhere to be found, having seemingly vanished into the labyrinthine depths of the cave system. As crime scene technicians worked to document the scene and recover Frank's remains, I found myself lost in a haze of shock and disbelief. In the days and weeks that followed, our quiet town was transformed. Fear gripped the community as news of the attack spread. Despite extensive searches by local law enforcement and even a team of professional hunters brought in from out of state, no trace of the creature was ever found. Theories abounded. Some believed it was a previously undiscovered species, while others clung to more supernatural explanations. Cryptozoologists and paranormal investigators descended on the town, much to the annoyance of local residents who just wanted life to return to normal. For me, there was no return to normalcy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's malevolent gaze, heard Frank's final screams echoing through the cave. I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at me. If I hadn't involved Frank, he might still be alive. As the weeks turned to months and then to years, the incident faded from the forefront of public consciousness. But for those of us who had been directly involved, the scars remained. I found myself unable to venture into the woods alone, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that telltale growl. The cave was sealed off, deemed too dangerous for further exploration. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, some swore they could still hear strange noises emanating from deep within the earth, noises that didn't belong to any known animal. As for me, I remained in my cabin, unable to bring myself to leave the place where it all began. Perhaps it was a form of penance, or perhaps I felt a responsibility to stand guard against whatever might still be lurking in the depths of the forest. Whatever the reason, I knew that my life had been irrevocably changed by what I had witnessed. And so as I sit here on my porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, I can't help but wonder what else might be out there, hidden in the shadows of our world. What other ancient terrifying creatures might be waiting to be discovered? And more chillingly, how long before they decide to make their presence known once again? The forest holds its secrets close, and some mysteries I've learned are better left unsolved. But as darkness falls and the woods come alive with the sounds of night, I know that somewhere out there something is watching, waiting, and I fear that one day it will return to finish what it started. In the months following Frank's death, a pall seemed to hang over the entire town. What had once been a close-knit community of friendly faces and warm greetings became a place of suspicion and fear. People hurried through their daily tasks, casting furtive glances at the tree line, as if expecting the monster to emerge at any moment. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised, and the woods that had once been a place of adventure and exploration became strictly off-limits. I found myself at the center of it all, though not by choice. As the only surviving witness to the creature's existence, I was bombarded with questions from law enforcement, wildlife experts, and eventually, the media. Each retelling of that horrific night reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal, forcing me to relive the terror and guilt over and over again. The official investigation dragged on for weeks but ultimately proved fruitless. Despite the best efforts of local police and even a team of federal agents brought in to assist, no concrete evidence of the creature's existence was ever found beyond the gruesome scene in the cave. The tracks I had followed that first day had long since been washed away by rain, and the forest seemed to have swallowed any other traces of the beast's presence. As the lack of new leads caused public interest to wane, a new narrative began to emerge. Whispers started circulating that perhaps there had been no monster at all. Some suggested that Frank and I had stumbled upon an illegal drug operation in the cave, and that his death was the result of a confrontation with dangerous criminals. Others more cruelly insinuated that I might have had something to do with Frank's demise, concocting the story of the creature to cover my tracks. These rumors cut deep, adding another layer of pain to my already fragile emotional state. Frank had been my friend, one of the few people who had welcomed me to town without reservation. The idea that anyone could think I had harmed him was almost unbearable. Despite the skepticism and accusations, I knew what I had seen. The image of that creature, with its intelligent eyes and blood-stained fur, was seared into my memory. No human, no matter how depraved, could have been responsible for the carnage I witnessed in that cave. As summer faded into autumn, I found myself withdrawing more and more from the community. My cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. I spent countless sleepless nights staring out into the darkness, jumping at every creak of the old wooden structure and every rustle of leaves outside. My garden, which had once been a source of pride and sustenance, lay abandoned. I couldn't bring myself to tend to it, knowing that it had been the starting point of this nightmare. The untamed wilderness seemed to creep closer to my doorstep with each passing day, as if nature itself was reclaiming the space I had carved out for myself. It was during one of these long, restless nights that I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. From somewhere in the depths of the forest came a long, mournful howl. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, neither wolf nor bear, but something altogether more chilling. The sound seemed to carry with it an ancient sorrow, a primordial rage that echoed through the trees and resonated in my very bones. I sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe, as the howl faded away. In its wake came a silence more profound than any I had ever experienced, as if every creature in the forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. When dawn finally broke, I was still sitting in the same spot, my muscles stiff and my mind racing. Had I truly heard that sound, or was it a product of my overtaxed imagination? Part of me wanted to dismiss it as nothing more than a dream, but deep down I knew the truth. The creature was still out there, and it was letting its presence be known. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Deputy Wilson, who had been involved in the initial investigation, answered on the third ring. His voice was groggy with sleep, but he snapped to attention as soon as I identified myself. Mr. Hawthorne, what's going on? Are you all right? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I heard it, Deputy. Last night. The creature, it's still out there. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Wilson spoke again, his tone was cautious, measured. John, are you sure about this? We've been over every inch of those woods, and we haven't found a single trace of anything unusual. I know what I heard, I insisted, a note of desperation creeping into my voice. It wasn't like any animal I've ever encountered. Please, you have to believe me. Wilson sighed heavily. Look, John, I understand you've been through a lot, but we can't go chasing after every strange sound in the forest. Unless you've got some concrete evidence, there's not much we can do. His words hit me like a physical blow. I realized then that I was alone in this, that no one else truly believed or understood the danger that lurked in the shadows of the forest. As I hung up the phone, a sense of resolve began to crystallize within me. If the authorities wouldn't act, then it was up to me to find the truth and protect the community from this hidden threat. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research, poring over every book and article I could find on local wildlife, cryptozoology, and indigenous legends. I reached out to experts in various fields, seeking any information that might shed light on what I had encountered. Most dismissed me outright, but a few seemed intrigued by my story, offering theories and suggestions that only served to deepen the mystery. As my investigation progressed, I began to piece together a disturbing pattern. Delving into historical records, I uncovered reports of similar incidents stretching back decades, even centuries. Mysterious disappearances, livestock found mutilated in ways that defied explanation, and sightings of a creature that matched the description of what I had seen in the cave. Each incident had been dismissed or explained away, but taken together, they painted a chilling picture of a predator that had been stalking these woods for generations. Armed with this new information, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I knew it was dangerous, perhaps even foolish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one who truly understood the threat we were facing. And so, on a crisp autumn morning, I set out into the forest once more, determined to find evidence that would force the authorities to take action. I packed carefully for the expedition, filling my backpack with supplies for several days in the wilderness. A high-powered rifle was slung over my shoulder. I had no illusions about being able to take down the creature if I encountered it, but the weapon provided a small measure of comfort. As I locked the door of my cabin behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might never see it again. The forest seemed different now, charged with a palpable sense of menace. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every rustle of leaves a harbinger of terror. I pushed on, following the faint game trails deeper into the wilderness, my senses on high alert for any sign of the creature's presence. As the day wore on, I began to notice subtle changes in the environment. The usual sounds of forest life, birdsong, the chatter of squirrels, the buzz of insects, grew increasingly scarce. An unnatural silence descended, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the pounding of my own heart. It was late afternoon when I stumbled upon the first concrete sign that I was on the right track. In a small clearing, I found a series of massive paw prints pressed into the soft earth. They were similar to the tracks I had followed months ago, but even larger, deeper. Whatever had left these marks was growing, becoming more powerful. With renewed determination, I followed the trail. It led me through dense underbrush and over rocky outcroppings, always heading deeper into the most remote parts of the forest. As twilight began to fall, I realized I had ventured farther from civilization than I had ever been before. Just as I was considering making camp for the night, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees that made my blood run cold. Ahead, barely visible in the fading light, was the entrance to another cave. This one was larger than the first, its mouth a gaping wound in the side of a steep hill. The stench hit me before I even reached the entrance. That same sickly sweet odor I remembered from months ago, but stronger now, more pungent. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee while I still could. But I had come too far to give up now. Steeling my nerves, I clicked on my flashlight and stepped into the darkness of the cave. The beam of light seemed feeble against the oppressive blackness, barely illuminating a few feet ahead. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing ominously off the stone walls. I moved slowly, cautiously, my free hand trailing along the rough cave wall for guidance. The air grew colder with each step, and that horrible smell intensified until it was almost overwhelming. I fought back the urge to gag, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. It was then that I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the very rock around me. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give away my position. Slowly, I swung my flashlight beam around, searching for the source of the sound. What I saw in that moment would haunt me for the rest of my days. There, in a chamber just off the main tunnel, stood the creature. It was even larger than I remembered, its massive frame filling the space from floor to ceiling. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, gleaming with an otherworldly intelligence, fixed upon me with unmistakable hunger. Time seemed to stand still as we regarded each other. I knew I should run, should fight, should do something, but I found myself paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a primal fear unlike anything I had ever experienced. The creature made the first move. With a roar that shook dust from the cave ceiling, it lunged toward me. I stumbled backward, my fingers fumbling with the rifle. I managed to get off a single shot before the beast was upon me, its hot breath on my face, its claws raking across my chest. The pain was immediate and intense, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled away, firing blindly into the darkness. The creature's roars of rage echoed through the cave, mingling with my own cries of terror and pain. Somehow, I found myself back at the cave entrance. I burst out into the night air, running blindly through the forest. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I pushed on, driven by a desperate need to escape. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. When I finally collapsed, gasping for breath and shaking uncontrollably, I found myself in a small clearing I didn't recognize. Blood soaked through my torn shirt, and every movement sent waves of pain through my body. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full weight of what had just happened crashed down upon me. I had found the creature, had come face to face with it once again, but in doing so, I had only managed to anger it further. And now, injured and lost in the depths of the forest, I realized I might have sealed not only my own fate, but that of the entire town. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, praying that I would have signal this deep in the wilderness. To my immense relief, a single bar flickered to life. I dialed 911, my vision blurring as I fought to stay conscious. "Please," I gasped as soon as the dispatcher answered. "I need help. It's out here. The creature, it's real. You have to send someone, please." As I gave my approximate location, darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of that bone-chilling howl, echoing through the forest once more. Whether it was a cry of triumph or a promise of things to come, I couldn't say. All I knew was that the nightmare was far from over. I awoke to the sterile white of a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors, a constant reminder that I had, against all odds, survived my encounter in the cave. As consciousness slowly returned, so too did the memories of that terrifying night. I tried to sit up, only to be met with a wave of pain that left me gasping. "Easy there, Mr. Hawthorne," a gentle voice said. I turned to see a nurse adjusting my IV. "You've been through quite an ordeal. Try not to move too much." Over the next few days, as I drifted in and out of lucidity, I pieced together what had happened after I lost consciousness in the forest. A search and rescue team had found me barely alive, guided by the GPS signal from my phone. I had been airlifted to the nearest trauma center, where doctors had worked for hours to repair the damage inflicted by the creature's claws. As my condition stabilized, I found myself besieged by visitors. Police officers came to take my statement, their faces a mixture of concern and skepticism as I recounted my experience in the cave. Wildlife experts peppered me with questions, trying to reconcile my description of the creature with known species. And always hovering in the background were the reporters, eager for any scrap of information about the forest fiend, as they had taken to calling it. But it was the visit from Sheriff Callahan that truly drove home the gravity of the situation. He entered my room late one evening, his weathered face grave as he pulled up a chair beside my bed. "John," he began, his voice low and serious, "I need you to understand something. What you've been through, what you've seen, it's causing a panic. People are scared, and scared people do stupid things. I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand to silence me. I'm not saying I don't believe you, he continued. Hell, after what happened to Frank and now this? He gestured to my bandaged chest. I'd be a fool to dismiss it entirely, but we've got a situation on our hands and I need your help to manage it. Over the next hour, Sheriff Callahan laid out the full extent of what had been happening in town while I was recovering. Vigilante groups had formed, arming themselves and venturing into the forest in search of the creature. Tourists, drawn by the sensational news reports, were flocking to the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the monster or perhaps make a name for themselves by capturing it. And underlying it all was a current of fear that threatened to tear the community apart. We need to approach this carefully, the sheriff said. If we're not smart about this, someone else is going to get hurt or worse. I nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that now rested on our shoulders. As the only person to have encountered the creature and lived to tell about it twice, I had a unique perspective on the danger we were facing. But I also knew that charging blindly into the forest, as I had done, would only lead to more tragedy. As I recovered, a plan began to take shape. Working closely with Sheriff Callahan and a select team of experts, we developed a strategy to systematically search the forest, using the latest technology to try and track the creature's movements. Trail cameras were set up at strategic points, and teams of trained trackers began combing the woods for any sign of the beast's presence. But even as we made preparations, reports of strange occurrences continued to filter in. Livestock went missing from farms on the outskirts of town. Hikers reported hearing unusual sounds deep in the forest, and on more than one occasion, residents swore they had seen a massive, shadowy figure moving through their backyards in the dead of night. The tension in town reached a boiling point when a group of out-of-town hunters, determined to make a name for themselves, ventured deep into the forest against all warnings. They were found 3 days later, or what was left of them, their bodies torn apart in a manner chillingly similar to what I had witnessed in the cave months earlier. This tragic event seemed to galvanize the community. The skeptics who had dismissed my story as the ravings of a traumatized mind were forced to confront the reality of the situation. A town meeting was called, and for the first time people began to speak openly about their fears and experiences. As I stood before my neighbors, recounting once again the horrors I had witnessed, I saw a change come over the crowd. The fear and suspicion that had divided us began to give way to a sense of shared purpose. We were all in this together, facing a threat that none of us fully understood, but that we could no longer ignore. In the weeks that followed, our search efforts intensified. The forest was systematically mapped and divided into sectors, each to be thoroughly searched by teams equipped with the latest in tracking technology. I insisted on being part of these expeditions, despite the concerns of my doctors and the sheriff. I knew the risks, but I also knew that my experience with the creature might prove invaluable. It was during one of these searches that we made a breakthrough. Deep in the most remote part of the forest, in an area so dense with vegetation that it had been nearly impenetrable, we discovered a network of caves unlike anything we had seen before. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of vines, but once inside, the caverns seemed to stretch on endlessly, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that disappeared into the earth. The stench that had become all too familiar to me permeated the air, growing stronger as we ventured deeper into the cave system. Our flashlight beams danced across the rough stone walls, revealing claw marks and strange, primitive paintings that seemed to depict a creature eerily similar to what I had encountered. As we pressed on, the sense of unease among our team grew palpable. Even the most skeptical members of the search party couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to close in around us with each step. The air grew colder, damper, and that sickly sweet odor intensified until it was almost unbearable. It was in the largest chamber, deep within the heart of the cave system, that we found it. Our lights illuminated a scene of nightmarish proportions. Piles of bones, some ancient and yellowed with age, others disturbingly fresh, littered the floor. Tattered remnants of clothing and personal effects were scattered among the grisly remains, silent testaments to the lives that had been lost here. But it was what we found at the center of the chamber that truly chilled us to the bone. There, etched into the living rock of the cave floor, was an enormous depression, a nest of sorts lined with fur, feathers, and other organic matter, and all around it, arranged in a disturbingly deliberate pattern, were hundreds of skulls, human and animal alike, their empty eye sockets seeming to stare accusingly at us intruders. "Dear God," Sheriff Callahan whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water. "What are we dealing with here?" As if in answer to his question, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the cavern. We all froze, our hearts pounding in unison as the sound reverberated off the stone walls. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the space with an almost palpable menace. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice tight with fear. "Now!" No one argued. As quickly and quietly as we could, we began to retrace our steps through the winding tunnels. The journey back seemed to take an eternity, each shadow potentially concealing the monstrous creature we all knew was lurking somewhere in the darkness. Just as we caught sight of the cave entrance, a roar unlike anything I had ever heard before shook the very foundations of the earth around us. Rocks and debris rained down from the ceiling as we scrambled towards the exit, the sound of heavy footfalls growing louder behind us with each passing second. We burst out into the fading daylight, gasping for air and trembling with adrenaline. But our relief was short-lived. As we turned to look back at the cave entrance, we saw it, the creature that had haunted my nightmares for months, now revealed in all its terrifying glory. It was massive, far larger than I remembered, its body a horrifying amalgamation of bear and wolf, with other unidentifiable elements that defied natural law. But it was the eyes that truly struck terror into my heart, gleaming with an intelligence that was unmistakably alien, yet disturbingly familiar. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stood frozen, locked in a silent standoff with the beast. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very trees around us, it charged. What followed was chaos. Gunshots rang out as those members of our team who were armed opened fire. The creature's howls of rage mingled with the screams of terror from our group as we scattered, each person running blindly in an attempt to escape the nightmare that pursued us. I found myself sprinting through the forest, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as I ran, but I didn't dare slow down or look back. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but sheer terror kept me moving forward. It wasn't until I burst out onto the main road, nearly colliding with a police cruiser that had been patrolling the area, that I finally allowed myself to stop. As I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, I heard the crackle of radio static as the officer called for backup. In the days that followed, the full extent of what had happened in the forest became clear. Of the 12 people who had entered the cave system, only 7 made it out alive. The others were presumed dead, their bodies never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The evidence we had gathered in the cave, combined with the eyewitness accounts of those who survived the encounter, was impossible to ignore. Local and state authorities were forced to acknowledge the existence of the creature, and a full-scale operation was launched to contain and neutralize the threat. The forest was declared off-limits to civilians, cordoned off by military personnel and wildlife experts. Hunters and trackers from across the country were brought in, armed with tranquilizer guns and advanced tracking equipment. Their goal was to capture the creature alive if possible, to study and understand it. But as weeks turned into months with no success, frustration and fear began to mount. Sightings of the creature became more frequent, and it seemed to be growing bolder, venturing closer to populated areas under the cover of darkness. It was clear that our efforts to contain the situation were failing. The creature was too intelligent, too adaptable to be caught by conventional means. And with each passing day, the danger to the surrounding communities grew. As autumn gave way to winter, a sense of desperation settled over the town. People spoke in hushed tones about abandoning their homes, about the government bombing the entire forest to eradicate the threat once and for all. The once peaceful community had become a place of constant fear and suspicion. It was during this dark time that I made a decision that would change everything. I knew the creature better than anyone. I had looked into its eyes, had survived its attacks twice. If anyone had a chance of ending this nightmare, it was me. Late one night, as the first snow of winter began to fall, I slipped past the military cordon and back into the forest. I carried with me only the essentials: food, water, and a high-powered rifle. I knew it was likely a suicide mission, but I also knew that I couldn't stand by and watch as more innocent lives were lost. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the silence was oppressive. No birds sang, no small animals scurried through the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I made my way back to the cave system we had discovered, my heart pounding with each step. The entrance loomed before me, a yawning mouth of darkness that seemed to beckon me forward. Taking a deep breath, I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The caverns were just as I remembered them, a maze of tunnels and chambers that seemed to go on forever. But now, armed with the knowledge of what lay within, I moved with purpose, making my way towards the central chamber where we had discovered the creature's lair. As I entered the vast space, my light fell upon the gruesome collection of bones and skulls. But something was different. The massive depression in the center of the chamber, the nest we had discovered, was empty. A low growl from behind me made my blood run cold. Slowly I turned, and there it was. The creature stood blocking the entrance to the chamber, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness of the tunnel beyond. Those intelligent alien eyes fixed upon me with unmistakable recognition. In that moment, as we faced each other in the depths of the earth, I realized a truth that shook me to my core. This wasn't just some animal, some freak of nature. There was a consciousness behind those eyes, an ancient intelligence that seemed to look right through me. And then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a guttural, rumbling vocalization that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my mind. I couldn't understand the words, if they were words at all, but the meaning was clear. This ends now. What followed was a confrontation that defied description. It wasn't just a physical battle, though that was part of it. Claws raked across my skin, and I fired my rifle again and again, the muzzle flashes illuminating the cavern in strobe-like bursts. But there was something else happening, a mental struggle that left me reeling. Images flashed through my mind: ancient forests, primordial seas, civilizations rising and falling. I saw the creature, or others like it, moving through the shadows of history, always watching, always waiting. I understood then that what we were facing was something far older and more complex than we had ever imagined. The physical and mental assault was overwhelming. I found myself on the brink of consciousness, my body broken and my mind stretched to its limits. But as I lay there, teetering on the edge of oblivion, a strange calm settled over me. With the last of my strength, I reached out, not with my hands, but with my mind. I pushed past the fear, past the pain, and tried to convey a single desperate thought. Enough. No more death, no more fear. Let it end. There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. Then slowly the creature approached. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. But instead of the killing blow I expected, I felt a gentle touch on my forehead. A warmth spread through my body, and with it came understanding. The creature, no, the being, had been trapped here, bound to this place by forces it couldn't control. It had lashed out in fear and confusion, its actions driven by a desperate need to survive in a world it no longer recognized. As this knowledge filled me, I felt the being's presence in my mind begin to fade. When I opened my eyes, I was alone in the cavern, but I knew with a certainty that defied explanation that it was over. The creature was gone, having used the last of its strength to break free from whatever had held it here for so long. I don't know how long I lay there in the darkness before the search team found me. I was barely conscious, my body battered and my mind reeling from what I had experienced. As they carried me out of the cave and back into the world above, I tried to explain what had happened. But the words felt inadequate, unable to capture the profound and terrifying truth I had discovered. In the months that followed, as I recovered from my injuries, the story of the forest fiend gradually faded from the headlines. No more sightings were reported, no more mysterious deaths occurred. To most it seemed that the nightmare had simply ended as mysteriously as it had begun. But I knew the truth, and on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees and the shadows seem to move with a life of their own, I find myself looking to the forest with a mixture of fear and wonder. For I know now that our world is far stranger and more magnificent than we ever imagined, and that there are beings out there beyond our comprehension, moving through the secret places of the earth. The creature may be gone, but the mystery remains. And I can't help but wonder what other ancient intelligences might be out there, watching and waiting in the shadows of our world. The thought both terrifies and exhilarates me, for I know now that the boundary between myth and reality is far more permeable than we ever dared to believe. As I sit here penning these words in the quiet of my cabin, I can't shake the feeling that my encounter in the cave was just the beginning. The world has changed for me, the veil between what we think we know and what truly exists lifted ever so slightly. And though the creature is gone, I know that there are other mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered. Perhaps one day, when I've fully recovered and gathered my courage, I'll venture back into those woods, not to hunt or to fear, but to understand. For in that moment of connection in the cave, I glimpsed something profound, a truth about the nature of existence that both humbles and inspires me. Until then, I'll continue to watch the forest from my porch, a sentinel guarding the boundary between two worlds. And if, on some moonlit night, I hear a distant howl that doesn't quite belong to any known animal, I'll smile to myself, knowing that the wonders and terrors of our world are far greater than we could ever imagine. The September morning air felt unusually thick as I merged onto Lafayette Road, the main thoroughfare cutting through the Chickamauga battlefield. The dashboard clock read 6:42, and the sun hadn't quite breached the horizon, leaving the historical grounds draped in a gray pallor. I'd driven this route to work hundreds of times before, the familiar path taking me past weather-worn monuments and silent cannon that stood sentinel over the grounds where thousands had died during the Civil War. The battlefield had always given me an odd feeling, but I'd grown accustomed to it over the years. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering about the stories these grounds held, the last breaths, final thoughts, and unfulfilled promises of young men who never made it home. But that morning felt different. The air seemed to press against my car windows with an almost tangible weight. I'd taken to listening to true crime podcasts during my morning commute. But that day, the voices discussing murder cases felt somehow disrespectful. I switched it off, leaving only the low hum of my Honda Civic's engine and the occasional crunch of tires over patches of gravel that had scattered onto the asphalt. As I approached the tower, a stark stone structure that rose from the battlefield like a broken tooth, the first truly strange thing happened. Through the pre-dawn gloom, my headlights caught something that made me ease off the accelerator. A white-tailed deer standing perfectly still in the center of the road. This wasn't entirely unusual. Deer were common in the area, and I'd had plenty of close calls over the years. But something about this one made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't grazing or looking around nervously like most deer do. Instead, it stood completely motionless, its head turned toward the dense woods that bordered the road. I tapped my horn lightly, expecting the deer to bolt like they always do. Nothing. It remained frozen, as if carved from stone. Frustration began to override my initial unease. I was already cutting it close for my shift at the hospital, and I didn't have time for this. I revved my engine, the sound echoing off the surrounding trees. Still nothing. I revved again, louder this time. The deer's ear twitched, but otherwise it might as well have been stuffed and mounted. On the third rev, something changed in the air, like the pressure dropping before a storm. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I revved the engine a fourth time. What happened next defied everything I knew about animal behavior and, frankly, physics. The deer's front legs left the ground, but not in a leap. Slowly, deliberately, it rose until it was standing on its hind legs like a person. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, the wrongness of its posture, the impossible angle of its spine. Then it turned its head. Not like a deer checking its surroundings, but a complete 180-degree rotation that no living creature should be capable of. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I realized they weren't the soft brown eyes of a deer at all. They were milky white, like cataracts, but with pinprick black pupils that seemed to bore into my soul. My foot slammed onto the gas pedal before my brain could fully process what I was seeing. The engine roared as I threw the car into reverse, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The rearview camera showed nothing but empty road behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following. I backed up until I reached a wide spot in the road where I could turn around, my heart thundering against my ribs. As I spun the wheel, my headlights swept across the spot where the deer had been standing. The road was empty now, but something dark glistened on the asphalt, something that looked unsettlingly like hoof prints, but deeper than any deer should have made. I called out sick from work that day, spending hours researching the history of Chickamauga battlefield. I'd known the basics, that it was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, with over 34,000 casualties, but I found myself diving deeper into personal accounts and local legends, stories of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and the famous Green Eyes ghost that was said to still patrol the battlefield at night. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There had to be a logical explanation for what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I dozed off for a split second at the wheel. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real, and something else nagged at me, a feeling that this wasn't over. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to tell my girlfriend Maria about what had happened. She listened with the kind of skeptical patience I'd expected, her dark eyes studying my face as I stumbled through the story. To my surprise, instead of telling me I was crazy, she suggested we go back. "If something weird is really happening out there, don't you want to know what it is?" she asked, her psychology degree showing. "Besides, you have to drive that route to work anyway. Better to face it head on than let it mess with your head." She had a point, but that didn't make it any easier when we pulled onto the battlefield grounds just after sunset 4 days after my initial encounter. The park was technically closed, but the roads remained open, and there was something comforting about having another person in the car, even if that person was currently engaged in a heated phone argument with her mother about Thanksgiving plans. The familiar landmarks looked different in the growing darkness. Shadows seemed to move between the trees, and every monument looked like a crouching figure until we got close enough for the headlights to reveal its true nature. I pulled over near the tower, killing the engine but leaving the headlights on. Maria was still on the phone, her voice rising with frustration as she argued about bringing her new boyfriend to the family gathering. I needed some air and some nicotine to calm my nerves. "I'm going to step out for a smoke," I whispered, holding up my pack of Camels. She nodded absently, deep in her conversation. The moment I closed the car door, I was struck by the absolute silence of the place. No crickets, no distant traffic, not even the rustle of wind through the trees. The only sound was the muffled voice of Maria in the car, and even that seemed somehow wrong, like it was being swallowed by the darkness. I lit my cigarette with trembling hands, the flame of my lighter briefly illuminating the area around me. That's when I heard it, the snap of a twig to my left, followed by another to my right. My heart rate doubled instantly as I remembered stories about predators circling their prey. I squinted into the darkness and my blood ran cold. There, at the edge of the headlight's reach, were eyes, not just one pair, but several, glowing with that same milky white sheen I'd seen on the deer. A low growl rolled across the ground, so deep it seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. I didn't waste time trying to make out what I was looking at. I dropped my cigarette and bolted for the car door, but something was wrong. The distance seemed to stretch, the car getting further away with each step, even though I knew that was impossible. Behind me, the growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Then I felt it, warm breath on the back of my neck, carrying the unmistakable smell of decay. My legs went weak, but somehow I kept running. I reached for the door handle just as something brushed against my back, something that felt like fingers but too long, too cold. I practically dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. Maria finally ended her call, looking at me with concern. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before I could answer, something large moved in front of the headlights, just for a second, but long enough to see that it walked on 2 legs, was far too tall to be human, and had the head of a deer with those horrible milky eyes. I gunned the engine and peeled out of there, tires throwing gravel as we fishtailed onto the main road. Maria gripped the dashboard, demanding to know what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. I didn't slow down until we were miles away from the battlefield, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. When I finally pulled over at a well-lit gas station, I told her everything, both encounters, the eyes, the growling, the thing that had almost caught me. To her credit, she didn't dismiss my story outright. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started researching. "There are other reports," she said after a few minutes. "Not exactly like yours, but similar. People seeing animals acting strangely, feeling watched, hearing growls. Some people think the battlefield is Thin Spot, a place where the barrier between our world and whatever's on the other side isn't as strong." I nodded, but I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about all the times I'd driven through the battlefield at night, completely unaware of what was watching from the shadows. I was thinking about the thousands of violent deaths that had occurred there, and whether something about all that pain and suffering had left a mark on the land itself. That was 3 weeks ago. I've since changed my route to work, adding 20 minutes to my commute to avoid the battlefield entirely. I've tried to convince myself that there must be a rational explanation for what happened, but deep down, I know better. Sometimes at night, I still dream about those milky white eyes and wake up with the phantom sensation of breath on the back of my neck. Maria's been doing more research into the history of Chickamauga, and what she's found is disturbing. The land was sacred to the Cherokee long before the Civil War, and they had their own stories about spirits that guarded the area. The battle itself was uncommonly brutal, with men fighting hand-to-hand in such darkness that they couldn't tell friend from foe. Many bodies were never recovered. I've thought about reporting what happened, but who would believe me? And more importantly, what good would it do? The battlefield has its secrets, and maybe they're better left undisturbed. All I know is that something out there wanted to send me a message that night, a warning that some places belong to the dead, and the living would do well to remember that. These days, when I drive past the battlefield entrance on my new route to work, I don't look toward the tower. But sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of something standing there watching. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can see it rise up on its hind legs. Michigan summers hold on to daylight like a miser clutching gold, especially in the northern reaches where the sun seems reluctant to surrender to night. It was in this extended twilight during the summer of 1999 that my then fiancée, now wife of 16 years, and another couple found ourselves on the Pyramid Point Trail in Sleeping Bear Dunes. The trail wound through dense hardwood forest before opening dramatically onto a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan. At nearly 200 feet above the water, the overlook offered an unobstructed view of the Manitou Passage and its namesake islands in the distance. The elevation made you feel like you were hovering above the world, suspended between earth and sky. I carried my old film camera with its 200 mm zoom lens, hoping to capture the legendary sunset over the Manitou Islands. The camera had been a college graduation gift, and though digital photography was beginning to emerge, there was something reassuring about the mechanical certainty of film. The evening had that particular quality unique to northern Michigan summers, a crispness to the air that spoke of pine forests and fresh water, mixed with the warmth of sun-baked sand. High winds pushed waves against the shoreline far below, creating a constant rhythm of crash and retreat that seemed to match our heartbeats. The forest behind us creaked and swayed, branches moving like dancers in the strengthening wind, while ahead of us stretched the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, its waters darkening as dusk settled over the landscape. Having spent my childhood summers in this region, I knew the lake's moods intimately, how it could shift from mirror calm to tempestuous within hours, how its waters could hide secrets beneath deceptively peaceful surfaces. Tonight, the 5-meter waves breaking against the distant shore were a common sight, their white caps visible even in the fading light, a reminder of the lake's raw power. By 10 o'clock, the sun had finally surrendered, leaving behind a palette of deep purples and blues that seemed to blur the boundary between sky and water. The Manitou Passage stretched before us, a 7-mile-wide channel of dark water that had claimed countless ships over the centuries. Somewhere out there, the North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse stood guard, though its automated light was barely visible in the gathering darkness. The lighthouse had always fascinated me. A solitary structure rising from the water, no longer staffed but still serving its purpose, a testament to human determination to master these treacherous waters. The four of us stood at the overlook, our conversation drifting between topics as naturally as the clouds above us. We discussed our upcoming camping plans, the peculiarities of northern Michigan weather, and the history of the passage before us. My fiancée, wrapped in a fleece jacket against the cooling air, pointed out the various spots where shipwrecks lay hidden beneath the waves. The other couple, experienced sailors themselves, shared stories of their own adventures on these waters, though always in more forgiving conditions than tonight's choppy surface suggested. The first flash came during a lull in conversation, a brief burst of light out on the water that seemed to pierce the gathering darkness like a needle through cloth. The timing was odd. Most pleasure craft would have sought harbor hours ago, given the building winds and roughening water. Commercial vessels typically stayed in the deeper shipping lanes further out, their running lights visible for miles. This light was different, focused, intentional, and somewhere between the mainland and the islands where no regular traffic should be. I had brought the old film camera more out of habit than any real expectation of night photography. The 200mm zoom lens had served me well over the years, capturing everything from wildlife to distant sailboats, but tonight it would become something far more important than a mere photographic tool. Raising it to my eye, I struggled to steady the lens against the gusting wind, trying to locate the source of that mysterious flash. Through the viewfinder, the world narrowed to a small circle of twilight, within which I could just make out what appeared to be a small vessel, though at this distance and in the failing light, details were frustratingly difficult to discern. We all carried hiking flashlights, nothing particularly powerful, just standard LED models meant for illuminating forest trails and finding your way back to camp after sunset. They seemed woefully inadequate for communicating across miles of open water, but in that moment, they were all we had. Without really expecting results, we aimed them toward the source of the mysterious light and flashed them several times, more in hope than expectation. The wind continued to gust around us, and the waves below crashed against the base of the cliff with increasing force, creating a constant background roar that seemed to emphasize our isolation on this wild shoreline. The response to our feeble light signals came with shocking immediacy. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. The universal distress signal burned through the darkness like an accusation. Our casual evening of stargazing transformed instantly into something far more grave. The pattern repeated, followed by a series of structured flashes that could only be Morse code, a language none of us could read but whose desperate urgency we all understood. The realization hit us with physical force. We were watching someone in serious trouble, separated from them by miles of violent water and gathering darkness. The decision to split up came naturally. My fiancé and I would sprint back to the car for supplies while our friends maintained visual contact with the vessel. The half-mile trail through the woods, which had been a pleasant hike up, now became a treacherous obstacle course. Our flashlight beams bounced wildly as we ran, transforming familiar trees into looming shadows. The steep descent, already challenging in daylight, became a controlled fall in the darkness. Roots and rocks conspired to trip us. Branches whipped at our faces, and the entire forest seemed to resist our urgent passage. We reached the car breathless and fumbling with keys. The late 90s cell phone lay in the glove compartment, a brick of a device that now represented someone's best hope for survival. In the trunk, a pair of binoculars nestled in their case, forgotten until this crucial moment. The dash clock read 10:17 p.m., a detail that would stick in my memory, marking the moment we moved from observers to participants in what was unfolding on the water. The call to the Coast Guard was an exercise in fighting against poor reception and the limitations of pre-GPS technology. We struggled to convey our exact location and what we were witnessing. The dispatcher's voice remained professionally calm, but her rapid-fire questions revealed the seriousness of the situation. How many flashes? What was the interval? Could we estimate the vessel's position relative to the lighthouse? Had we seen any other boats in the area? Each question underscored how little we actually knew about what was happening out there in the darkness. The run back up the trail seemed twice as long, every second stretched by the knowledge that someone's life might depend on our return. The binoculars bounced against my chest, and the phone kept losing signal as we climbed higher. By the time we crested the final rise, sweat plastered our clothes to our backs despite the cool night air. Our friends' faces told us something had changed. In the 20 minutes we'd been gone, the situation had deteriorated. Through the binoculars, we could now make out details that turned our concern to horror. An aluminum rowboat, pathetically small against the massive waves, with a single occupant fighting against conditions that would challenge even a properly equipped vessel. The boat would appear on the crest of a wave, then vanish into the trough, each disappearance lasting longer than the last. The mystery of why someone would be out there in such a small craft only added to the mounting tension. The SOS signals came more frequently now, each flash sequence punctuated by periods of darkness, during which we could only imagine the struggle taking place. We established a rhythm. They would signal, we would respond with our flashlights. A brief confirmation that someone still watched, still cared, still sought help. But our lights felt impossibly inadequate, like trying to empty the lake with a teaspoon. Through the binoculars, each glimpse of the struggling boat became more harrowing than the last. The occupant alternated between rowing with desperate energy and turning to signal us, each movement speaking of exhaustion and growing desperation. The waves had developed a malevolent rhythm, lifting the small craft skyward before plunging it into valleys of black water. Every time the boat disappeared into a trough, we held our breath, counting seconds until it reappeared. Sometimes the wait stretched so long that we began to fear the worst, only to see the tiny vessel emerge again, somehow still afloat. The wind had intensified, carrying the deep-throated roar of waves crashing against the cliffs below us. Clouds scudded across the moon, alternatively brightening and darkening the scene before us. Each time the moonlight broke through, we could see the rowboat had drifted further north, caught in the passage's notorious current. The sailor was fighting not just the waves, but also the inexorable pull of the water, each stroke of the oars a battle against forces that had claimed countless larger vessels throughout the centuries. Our attempt to maintain phone contact with the Coast Guard became an exercise in frustration. The overlook's elevation that gave us such a clear view of the unfolding drama also played havoc with cell reception. We discovered a single spot, precariously close to the cliff's edge, where the phone would show one bar of signal. Taking turns, we would stand there, shouting updates into the phone while bracing against the wind. The Coast Guard's responses were professional, but increasingly terse. A vessel was en route, they assured us, but the conditions were challenging, and the search area was vast. The passage of time became distorted, marked only by the rhythmic flashing of SOS signals and our responses. Each flash sequence revealed subtle changes in the boat's situation. It was riding lower in the water now, the waves breaking over its bow more frequently. Through the binoculars we could see the occupant constantly bailing, each pause in rowing threatening to swamp the small craft. The distance between signals grew longer, whether from exhaustion or the need to focus on survival we couldn't tell. Around us, the darkness of a northern Michigan night had fully descended, but it wasn't the complete darkness of inland areas. The water seemed to hold and reflect what little light remained, creating a ghostly illumination that transformed the passage into something ancient and unknowable. The waves were black mountains now, their white caps appearing and disappearing like phantom lights, creating a disorienting effect that made it increasingly difficult to maintain visual contact with the boat. Near 11 o'clock, we heard it, the deep thrum of powerful engines cutting through the night. A tugboat appeared from the southern end of the passage, its searchlight cutting a brilliant white arc through the darkness. The vessel moved in a methodical pattern, sweeping back and forth across the water in a grid formation that spoke of professional search and rescue techniques. We tried signaling it with our flashlights, attempting to direct it toward where we'd last seen the rowboat. But our lights seemed pitifully weak against the vastness of the lake. The tugboat's appearance was soon followed by the arrival of a Coast Guard vessel from the northern end of the passage, its distinctive red stripe barely visible in the darkness. The two ships created a choreography of light and shadow across the water, their searchlights cutting through the night like giant scythes. The methodical nature of their search pattern was both reassuring and maddening. Reassuring because it spoke of professional rescue protocols, maddening because we knew the rowboat had drifted significantly north of their initial search area. The night had grown preternaturally cold for a Michigan summer, the wind carrying a bite that seemed to cut through our jackets. We huddled together at the overlook, passing the binoculars between us, each taking turns scanning the increasingly turbulent waters. The moon played cruel tricks, every whitecap potentially the lost boat, every shadow possibly a human figure. Our flashlights had grown noticeably dimmer, the batteries weakening from constant use, yet we continued to signal periodically, maintaining our vigil even though we'd lost sight of our target. The passage, nearly 7 miles wide and equally long, had become a vast black theater of possibilities. The rescue vessel's searchlights revealed tantalizingly brief glimpses of the water's surface. A floating log here, a cluster of debris there, but no sign of the aluminum boat or its occupant. The waves had grown larger, their crests now regularly broken by the wind into sheets of spray that further reduced visibility. The sound of the water below us had changed too, developing a deeper, more threatening note that seemed to resonate in our bones. Around midnight, we witnessed a scene that would haunt our dreams for years to come. The Coast Guard vessel's searchlight swept across a particular section of water, illuminating what appeared to be an upturned boat. The light lingered for several heartbeats, but before the ship could maneuver closer, the object, if that's what it was, disappeared into the trough of a wave. When the beam returned to that location, nothing remained. We found ourselves holding our breath, willing the light to reveal something, anything, but the water remained obstinately empty. The tugboat had moved further north, following the current's natural flow, its searchlight methodically dissecting the darkness. The coordination between the two vessels was impressive, their paths interlocking to cover maximum area while maintaining safe distances in the challenging conditions. But as the hours wore on, their search patterns began to expand, moving further apart, suggesting they were transitioning from an active rescue operation to a wider search effort. Our own helplessness became increasingly difficult to bear. We had maintained our position at the overlook for nearly 3 hours, our earlier panic giving way to a deep, gnawing dread. The mystery of why someone would be out in a rowboat on such a night so far from shore plagued our thoughts. Was it a foolhardy attempt to reach the lighthouse, a fishing trip gone terribly wrong, or something more sinister? The lack of answers only intensified our sense of responsibility as the only witnesses to this unfolding drama. By 1 a.m, the search patterns of both vessels had changed significantly. Their movements became wider, less urgent, the methodical grid system dissolving into broader sweeps across the passage. The tugboat had moved so far north it was becoming difficult to distinguish its searchlight from the occasional glimmer of distant lightning on the horizon. The Coast Guard vessel maintained a closer position, but its search pattern suggested they no longer expected to find someone alive in the water. The temperature had dropped further, and the wind carried the first hints of an approaching weather system. The moon had disappeared behind a bank of clouds, leaving only the artificial illumination of the rescue vessels to pierce the darkness. Each sweep of their searchlights revealed the increasing turbulence of the water, waves now regularly topping 6 meters, their faces streaked with wind-thrown foam. The conditions that had seemed challenging earlier now appeared absolutely lethal. Our vigil had taken on a different character. The initial adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. We took turns walking back to the car to warm up, though none of us could bear to be away from the overlook for long. The fear of missing something, a light, a signal, any sign of life, kept drawing us back to our post despite the increasingly hostile conditions. The North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse, which had played such a crucial role in the evening's events, continued its automated blinking, indifferent to the drama unfolding in its waters. Its regular pattern seemed almost mocking now, a reminder of how close, yet impossibly far, safety had been for the person in the rowboat. The lighthouse's solitary beam swept across waters that might now hold another secret, another story to join the countless others lost in the passage's depths. Just before 2 in the morning, we watched the Coast Guard vessel make one final pass near the shoreline before turning south. The tugboat had already disappeared into the darkness to the north. The systematic search that had given us hope hours earlier had concluded without fanfare, without answers, without closure. The darkness that rushed in to fill the void left by their searchlights seemed absolute, as if the lake itself was drawing a curtain over the night's events. We made our way to the small tavern in Glen Arbor, hoping to find someone who might have heard something about the incident. The place was nearly empty, just a few locals nursing late-night drinks. The television above the bar showed nothing but late-night programming. No breaking news, no emergency bulletins, no indication that anything unusual had occurred on the lake. It was as if the entire event had been a shared hallucination, except for the bone-deep exhaustion we all felt and the lingering image of that solitary light flashing SOS into the darkness. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the lake's surface deceptively calm, showing no evidence of the previous night's drama. We called the Coast Guard station as soon as they opened, our voices hoarse from the night's shouting. The dispatcher who answered seemed to have no knowledge of the incident. Due to shift changes, she explained, she couldn't provide any information about the search operation or its outcome. Our detailed description of events was met with professional courtesy, but no answers. The local newspapers carried no reports of missing persons or recovered boats. The Maritime Bulletin Board at the Harbor Master's office showed no notices about the incident. It was as if the events we'd witnessed had been swallowed by the lake, along with whatever secrets it might have claimed that night. The only proof we had were the dying batteries in our flashlights and the haunting images burned into our memories. Over the following days, we found ourselves returning to the overlook at different times, drawn back by some inexplicable need for closure. The passage looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more navigable. Pleasure boats cruised between the islands and mainland, their passengers unaware they were crossing what might be someone's final resting place. The North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse stood stark against the blue sky, its automated signal now barely visible in the sunlight, offering no clues about what it had witnessed. The experience changed us in subtle but permanent ways. When the passage appears in the news now, reports of rough weather, missing boats, or successful rescues, we find ourselves transported back to that night. Every detail remains vivid. The desperate flash of SOS signals, the sound of waves against the cliffs, the gradually expanding search patterns of the rescue vessels, and the ultimate silence that followed. 16 years have passed since that night, but certain questions still haunt me. Who was the person in the rowboat? What desperate circumstance led them to be out there in such conditions? Did they somehow make it to safety, or did the lake add another story to its vast collection of mysteries? During summer visits to the area, I sometimes find myself scanning the water's surface, half expecting to see a light flashing in the darkness. The Manitou Passage continues its ancient rhythms, unperturbed by the dramas that play out on its surface. Lake Michigan holds its secrets close, and for every story that ends with a successful rescue, there are others that conclude only in questions. The incident has become part of the local lore, one more tale of the lake's power and mystery, whispered about in harborside bars and around campfires. When I look at the lake now, especially during those long summer twilights, I think about how thin the line is between safety and disaster, between being a witness and being a helpless observer. The weight of those hours spent on the overlook has never fully lifted. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I find myself drawn to the window, watching for lights in the distance, remembering how it felt to be someone's only connection to hope, and wondering if somewhere out there, someone else is standing watch, holding a light against the darkness. Time moves differently when you're young. The 2-day drive from Washington State to Minnesota stretched like an eternity in the back seat of our 1972 Pontiac Catalina, its vinyl seats sticking to my legs in the summer heat. The landscape outside morphed from the evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest to the endless prairies of the Midwest, each mile marker a countdown to what I considered my second home, my cousin's century-old farm. Before my father's back injury when I was 9, these summer pilgrimages were as reliable as the seasons themselves. We'd pack the car with snacks and pillows, my mother's carefully organized road maps spread across the dashboard like battle plans. The Catalina's radio would fade in and out as we crossed state lines, picking up local stations that offered windows into lives and places we'd never see. My father would sing along to whatever came through the static, his voice competing with the wind rushing through the partially opened windows. The farm itself existed in my mind as a collection of perfect moments. The creak of the hayloft ladder in the old red barn, the musty smell of ancient railroad boxcars repurposed as storage, the taste of fresh strawberries picked from the garden. Every summer added new layers to these memories, like rings in a tree trunk, marking my growth against the unchanging backdrop of rural Minnesota. But returning at 12, after a 3-year absence, felt like stepping into a familiar photograph, only to find all the colors had shifted. The farm was exactly as I remembered it. The weathered red barn still stood sentinel over fields of corn and soybeans. The ancient boxcars still rusted in their appointed places. But my perception had changed. The spaces that once seemed vast now felt smaller. The adventures that had thrilled me now seemed childish. The black and white TV in the living room, once ignored in favor of outdoor exploration, now drew me like a magnet. Billy Joel records replaced the sound of wind in the cornfields as my preferred soundtrack. Conversations about sports and music pushed aside the old games of kick the can and tag. I was caught in that awkward space between childhood and adolescence, too old for the simple pleasures that had once defined these visits, too young to fully understand what I was leaving behind. It was during one of those listless summer mornings, when boredom had driven me to count the cracks in the kitchen ceiling, that my cousin mentioned the forgotten graveyard. The words cut through my adolescent indifference like a knife. Here, finally, was something that spoke to my newly developing sense of the mysterious, something that didn't feel like a recycled childhood adventure. The plan came together over breakfast. We would pack sandwiches, take water bottles, and set out early the next morning. The adults, accustomed to our wanderings and satisfied that we were at least getting outside, asked few questions. Minnesota summers granted long days of light, but we still wanted to make the most of our expedition. Dawn found us in the farm's kitchen, assembling our provisions with the serious attention of Arctic explorers. The morning air carried that particular Midwestern summer quality, already humid at first light, promising a day of thick heat. We moved through dewdrops as big as marbles, our shoes quickly soaked from the tall grass. The landscape we crossed felt both familiar and foreign. Cornfields stretched toward the horizon, their rows creating valleys and canyons that only children could fully appreciate. We passed abandoned quarries, their limestone walls bleached white by countless summers, holding pools of water so clear you could see straight to the bottom. The woods appeared in patches, islands of shadow in the ocean of farmland. We stopped for lunch beside one of Minnesota's countless unnamed lakes. These bodies of water, scattered across the state like mirrors dropped from the sky, each held their own mysteries. This one was small, perhaps a quarter-mile across, its surface broken occasionally by fish seeking insects. We ate our sandwiches in comfortable silence, watching dragonflies patrol the shoreline. The graveyard, when we finally found it, didn't announce itself with dramatic fences or stone gates. Instead, nature had reclaimed it almost completely. A massive rose bush, gone wild over decades, had grown into a natural cathedral over the graves. Its thorny branches created a dome that blocked most of the sunlight, casting everything beneath in a green-tinted twilight. Entering required careful navigation through gaps in the thorny canopy. The temperature dropped noticeably inside, as if we'd stepped into a different season altogether. The first tombstone I saw stopped me in my tracks. The date carved into the weathered stone placed its occupant's death in 1863, during the height of the Civil War. The inscription was still legible, though lichen had started to claim the edges of the letters. More stones emerged from the shadows as my eyes adjusted. They all bore the same surname, Anderson, with dates spanning nearly 50 years. These weren't just random burials. This was a family's history written in stone, a chronicle of lives lived and lost on this very land. Farmers who had broken the prairie soil, planted the first crops, raised children, and eventually returned to the earth they had worked so hard to tame. Then my cousin pointed to an area deeper within the Rose Cathedral, his voice dropping to a whisper as if afraid to disturb the silence. What I saw there changed something fundamental in my understanding of life and death. 7 small tombstones stood in a perfect row, each topped with a carefully carved lamb. The stones were smaller than the others, sized to match their occupants, and the sight of them hit me with physical force. The dates told a story more terrible than any horror movie I'd sneaked watching on late-night TV. 7 children, all taken within weeks of each other in the winter of 1878. The oldest was 11, the youngest barely 2. The inscriptions spoke of beloved sons and cherished daughters, of angels called home too soon, of hearts broken beyond repair. Smallpox or scarlet fever. The killer wasn't named, but its devastation was carved in stone. Standing there, the humid Minnesota summer seemed very far away. I could almost see the scene, the frozen ground having to be broken repeatedly as the disease claimed child after child, the parents' grief turning as hard and cold as the winter itself. These weren't just historical facts. These were real children who had played in the same fields we'd just crossed, who had perhaps watched the same dragonflies dance over the same unnamed lake. A sudden breeze stirred the roses above us, sending dappled shadows dancing across the small stones. The lambs seemed to move in the shifting light, their stone faces wearing expressions that shifted between peace and sorrow. The silence in the grove grew heavier, more expectant, as if the very air was holding its breath. My previous excitement about discovering something cool had evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of trespass. We weren't explorers here. We were intruders, disturbing a place of deep and private grief. The carefully maintained grave markers, the loving inscriptions, the symbolic lambs, all spoke of a family's attempt to maintain connection with their lost children, to create a sacred space where their memory could live on. The journey back to the farm took on a different character. The same landscape we'd crossed so eagerly that morning now seemed overlaid with shadows of the past. Every old farmhouse we passed could have held similar stories of loss and grief. The unnamed lake where we'd eaten lunch might have witnessed countless scenes of both joy and sorrow across the decades. The approaching thunderstorm matched our somber mood, its dark clouds building in the west like mountains. The cornfields whispered with increasing urgency as the wind picked up, and we quickened our pace. By the time the farm appeared on the horizon, its familiar silhouette was backed by storm clouds the color of bruises. Dinner that evening passed in unusual silence. The approaching storm had turned the kitchen windows into dark mirrors, occasionally lit by distant lightning. The adults attempted normal conversation, but something in our demeanor must have communicated that we'd experienced something profound. When asked about our day, I found myself offering only the most basic responses, unable to put into words the weight of what we'd discovered. The farmhouse itself seemed different that night. The familiar creaks and settling sounds of the century-old structure took on new meaning. Every shadow in the corners, every darkened doorway, seemed to hold possibilities I'd never considered before. The stairs to my cousin's bedroom, which I'd climbed hundreds of times, suddenly felt steeper, longer, more significant. We retreated to the bedroom earlier than usual, neither of us interested in the usual evening activities. The storm was building in earnest now, the wind making the old windows rattle in their frames. Lightning flickered more frequently, each flash illuminating the farmyard below in stark photographic moments. The thunder grew closer, its deep rumble seeming to emanate from the earth itself rather than the sky. Then, between the thunder's growls, we heard it, a sound that didn't belong to any storm. A low, mournful moaning that seemed to weave through the wind like a thread of darker sound. At first I tried to rationalize it as the wind finding some odd angle of the house or barn, but the sound had too much purpose, too much emotion to be merely mechanical. I moved to the window, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The farmyard below was transformed by the storm into something unknown and ancient. Wind whipped through the grass, creating patterns like waves on a dark sea. The old barn's door swung back and forth, its hinges crying out in protest. Then came a flash of lightning that burned everything into sharp relief. In that frozen moment of illumination, they were there, small figures darting across the yard, moving in ways that denied both physics and reason. Their movements had a peculiar quality, like watching old film footage played at the wrong speed. Some seemed to float just above the grass, while others moved with the jerky randomness of wind-blown leaves, but they were unmistakably children. I grabbed my cousin, needing confirmation that I wasn't hallucinating. Another lightning flash revealed the scene again. More figures now, closer to the house, their forms becoming clearer. They wore clothes from another century, their faces pale as milk in the electric light. Most disturbing was their behavior. They seemed to be playing, engaging in some terrible parody of the games we'd played in that same yard during countless summer days. We stood frozen at the window, neither of us able to move or speak. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find explanations, tricks of the light, shadows from the swaying trees, our imagination overwrought from the day's discovery. But each lightning flash destroyed these comfortable explanations, showing us things that couldn't exist but undeniably did. The storm moved closer, its lightning now near constant, providing an unsettling strobe light effect of the scene below. The children's movements became more distinct, more purposeful. They played games we recognized, tag, hide and seek, the same timeless activities that had entertained generations of children on this farm. But there was something wrong about their movements, as if they were performing these games from memory rather than joy. The moaning sound grew louder, resolving itself into something that might have been singing, a warped version of old hymns or lullabies, the kind that might have been sung over small graves in a winter long past. The wind carried the sound in waves, sometimes clear enough to almost make out words, then fading into the storm's deeper voices. Eventually, we retreated to our beds, leaving the lights on like a barrier against the impossible. But sometime in the night, I awoke to darkness. Either the power had failed or someone had turned off the lights. The storm had moved directly overhead, but the thunder couldn't mask the new sounds that filled the room. Footsteps, light and quick, pattered across the wooden floor. They moved with the random energy of children at play, back and forth, around and around. The air had grown impossibly cold, each breath visible in the darkness. My cousin slept on, oblivious, leaving me alone with whatever had followed us home from that rose-covered grove. The overwhelming emotion wasn't fear, though fear was certainly present. Instead, I felt a deep, crushing sadness, an echo of the grief that had been carved into those small tombstones. It pressed against my chest like a physical weight, bringing tears to my eyes that I couldn't explain. The footsteps grew closer to my bed, accompanied by sounds that might have been whispers or might have been the rustle of old-fashioned clothing. In that moment, facing something beyond my understanding, I did the only thing I could think of. I apologized. The words came unbidden, a child's attempt to make right an unknown wrong. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." My whispered apologies continued into the darkness, each one feeling more meaningful than the last. The footsteps slowed, then paused as if listening. The crushing sadness in the room began to shift, transforming into something else. Not quite peace, but perhaps acceptance. Gradually, the pattering steps moved away, growing fainter until they merged with the storm's receding rumbles. Morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows summer storms in Minnesota. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the night's events feel like a shared dream. But at breakfast, reality reasserted itself in an unexpected way. My aunt, serving pancakes with practiced efficiency, casually asked if we'd been running around upstairs during the night. "We heard children playing," my uncle added, buttering his toast. "Thought you two were up there raising a ruckus." He said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather, but something in his tone suggested he knew better. The farm had been in his family for generations. How many nights had he lain awake, listening to those same footsteps? My cousin and I exchanged glances but said nothing. How could we explain what we'd witnessed? How could we describe the impossible sight of long-dead children playing in the storm-swept yard, or the sound of their phantom footsteps across ancient floorboards? Some experiences defy explanation, existing in the spaces between what we know and what we feel. That day, Everything on the farm looked different. The familiar buildings and fields now seemed layered with history, each corner potentially holding echoes of past lives and losses. The old boxcars, the barn's hayloft, the worn paths between buildings, all had been witness to generations of children playing, living, and sometimes dying far too young. Looking back now, I understand that what we encountered wasn't meant to frighten us. Those small spirits, if that's what they were, weren't seeking to cause harm. Perhaps they were drawn to our youth, to our carefree exploration of places they had once known. Or maybe our disturbance of their resting place had awakened memories that refused to stay buried beneath the wild roses. The rest of that summer took on a different character. We still played and explored, but with a new awareness of those who had come before us. The farm was no longer just a place of childhood adventures. It had become a bridge between past and present, a reminder that every patch of earth holds its own stories of joy and sorrow. Years later, I tried to find that overgrown graveyard again. The landscape had changed. Fields had been replanted, old paths had disappeared, new fences had been erected. The massive rose bush was gone, probably cleared for farming, taking with it the physical reminder of that family's tragedy. But sometimes, on storm-dark nights, I still hear echoes of those phantom footsteps and remember the lessons learned that summer about the thin line between past and present, between the world we see and the one we sense but cannot prove. The farm still stands, passing to new generations who add their own layers of history to its worn floorboards and weathered walls. I've never told my children about what happened that night, but someday, when they're old enough to understand, I'll take them to Minnesota. We'll walk those fields under the endless summer sky, and I'll teach them that some places hold more than just memories. They hold the very essence of those who came before, their joys and sorrows forever echoing through the quiet moments between storms. Growing up in the bustling heart of a major metropolis, I never expected to encounter the supernatural. The concrete jungle of skyscrapers and neon lights seemed an unlikely backdrop for ghostly apparitions or paranormal activity. Yet, as I would come to learn, the veil between our world and the next is thin everywhere, even in the most unlikely of places. My name is Isabella, and I was born with a birthmark on my right cheek, a small reddish splotch that my mother always said looked like a crescent moon. It wasn't until I was older that I realized this seemingly innocuous mark was far more than a simple quirk of pigmentation. It was a sign of something much deeper, much more ancient, a gift, or perhaps a curse that ran through the women in my family. My grandmother, Evelyn, had the same mark. So did my great-great-grandmother, Beatrice. It was a pattern that repeated itself, generation after generation, skipping one and manifesting in the next. With the mark came an ability that defied explanation, a sixth sense, if you will, that allowed us to perceive things beyond the realm of ordinary human experience. Growing up, I'd heard whispers of this gift from my mother and aunts. They spoke in hushed tones about Grandma Evelyn's uncanny ability to sense spirits, to see things that others couldn't. As a child, I dismissed these stories as nothing more than family folklore, the kind of tales that get passed down and embellished over time. How wrong I was. It was the summer of 2002 when I first realized that there was more to these stories than mere superstition. I was 6 years old, living in a modest apartment on the 17th floor of a high-rise in the city center. My days were filled with the typical concerns of a child: school, friends, and my ever-demanding Tamagotchi. But as night fell, a different world began to reveal itself to me. Our apartment wasn't large, but it felt cavernous in the dark. The hallway that connected the bedrooms to the living area seemed to stretch on forever, shadows pooling in the corners and doorways. It was in this corridor that I first saw them, the entities that would come to haunt my nights for years to come. I remember that first encounter vividly. It was a warm night in July, and I had gotten up to get a glass of water. As I padded down the hallway, my small feet barely making a sound on the carpet, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was my father. He worked the night shift and often came home in the early hours of the morning. But as I turned to look, I realized with a growing sense of dread that this was not my father at all. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. It was dark, not just in color but in substance, as if it were made of shadows given form. It moved with a strange, swaying motion, like seaweed undulating in an unseen current, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They were hollow pits of absolute darkness, seeming to draw in what little light there was in the hallway. I stood there, frozen in terror, unable to move or cry out. The entity didn't seem to notice me at first, continuing its bizarre, silent dance down the hallway. Then slowly its head turned towards me, those bottomless eyes fixed on mine, and I felt a chill that went beyond mere physical cold. It was as if my very soul was being touched by something ancient and utterly alien. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, the figure turned away and continued its journey, disappearing into the shadows at the end of the hall. I ran back to my room, diving under the covers and squeezing my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them again the world would make sense once more. But that was just the beginning. Night after night, I would see these shadow figures, their numbers growing, their silent movements becoming more frenzied. And as my fear grew, so did my understanding that I was witnessing something that others could not see, the first manifestation of a gift that would change my life forever. As the weeks turned into months and months into years, the nightly visitations became a terrifying routine. Every evening as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights flickered to life, I would feel a familiar dread settling in the pit of my stomach. The shadows would come, without fail, their silent parade a macabre spectacle that only I could witness. My days were normal enough. I'd wake up, have breakfast with my dad before he went to sleep, and then head off to school. My mother would pick me up in the afternoon, and we'd spend a few hours together before my father woke up to start his night shift. It was a life of clockwork precision, each day flowing into the next with predictable regularity. But as night fell, that comforting routine would shatter. The first sign was always a drop in temperature. Even on the hottest summer nights, I'd feel a chill creep into the room, raising goosebumps on my arms and sending shivers down my spine. Then the shadows would begin to move. It always started in the hallway, a flicker of movement, barely perceptible at first, like a curtain stirring in a non-existent breeze. Then, slowly, the shadows would coalesce, taking on those familiar, terrifying forms. Tall, impossibly thin figures, their bodies seeming to bend and sway in ways that defied physics. Their faces, if you could call them that, were featureless save for those haunting, hollow eyes. At first there was just one. It would glide down the hallway, passing by my partially open door, its gaze never quite meeting mine. But as time went on, more began to appear. 2, then 3, then a veritable parade of shadow figures, all engaged in their silent, swaying dance. I would lie in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. I wanted to scream, to call out to my mother for help, but terror had stolen my voice. All I could do was watch, wide-eyed and trembling, as the shadows moved through our home. They never entered my room, thank God, but they were everywhere else, in the hallway, the living room, the kitchen. I could see them through the crack in my door, their dark forms moving back and forth in an endless, maddening cycle. Sometimes I'd see one pause by my parents' bedroom door, its head tilting as if listening. In those moments, my fear would reach new heights. What if they went in? What if they did something to my mom and dad? But they never did. They always moved on, continuing their relentless patrol. The worst part was the silence. You'd think that with so many entities moving about, there would be some sound, a whisper, a footstep, anything. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive, suffocating silence of the night, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and my own ragged breathing. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just shadows from passing cars, or tricks of the light from the street lamps outside. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. These figures moved with purpose, with awareness. They were real as the bed I lay in or the teddy bear I clutched for comfort. As I grew older, I began to notice patterns in their behavior. They seemed to have favorite spots. The corner of the living room where my mother's old rocking chair sat. the space in front of the bathroom mirror, the area around our dining table. They would congregate in these places, their forms overlapping and intertwining in a grotesque dance. And always, always there was that feeling of being watched. Even when I couldn't see them directly, I could feel their presence, their hollow eyes boring into me from the darkness. It was a weight on my chest, a constant pressure that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. I began to dread bedtime. While other kids my age begged to stay up late, I would have given anything to sleep through the night, to close my eyes and open them again to find the sun streaming through my window. But that wasn't an option. Night after night, I was forced to witness this terrifying spectacle, powerless to stop it or even understand it. The worst nights were when I'd wake up in the middle of their procession. I'd open my eyes, disoriented from sleep, only to see a shadow figure standing at the foot of my bed, its hollow eyes fixed on me. In those moments, the line between nightmare and reality blurred, and I would lie there, paralyzed with fear, until sleep mercifully claimed me again. As the years passed, the number of shadow figures grew. What started as 1 became 2, then 5, then 8. By the time I was 8 years old, I would sometimes count over a dozen of these entities, all moving through our apartment in their bizarre, silent choreography. I never told my parents about what I saw. How could I? I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, that they'd think I was making it up or that something was wrong with me. And a part of me was terrified that if I spoke about the shadows, I would somehow make them more real, more powerful. So I kept my silence, enduring night after night of terror, watching helplessly as the shadows danced their way through my childhood. But as I would soon learn, silence is not always the best defense against the dark. It was a crisp autumn evening in 2004 when everything changed. I was 8 years old, and the weight of my nightly ordeal had begun to take its toll. My grades were slipping, I was withdrawn at school, and dark circles had taken up permanent residence under my eyes. My parents were worried, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. How do you explain to your mom and dad that your home is invaded every night by shadow people? That particular evening had been especially rough. I'd had a bad day at school, a math test I was sure I'd failed, a fight with my best friend, and to top it off, I'd forgotten my lunch at home. By the time night fell, I was a mess of pent-up emotions, tired, sad, and angry at the world. As usual, the temperature in the apartment dropped as darkness settled in. I lay in bed, waiting for the familiar parade of shadows to begin. But tonight was different. Maybe it was my emotional state, or maybe the entities sensed a change in me. But their movements seemed more frenzied, more purposeful. I watched through the crack in my door as they swept through the hallway, their forms blending and separating in a dizzying dance. 1, 2, 5, 8. I counted them as they passed, their hollow eyes seeming to glow with an inner darkness. But they didn't stop at 8. More came, filling the hallway, spilling into the living room and kitchen. My heart raced as I realized this was the most I'd ever seen at once. 15, 16, 17. The count kept rising. The air felt thick, heavy with their presence. It was hard to breathe, as if the very oxygen was being sucked out of the room. And then I saw it, a shadow figure larger than the rest. It moved differently, with a deliberate slowness that sent chills down my spine. As it approached my door, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. This one was different. This one felt aware. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I was tired of being afraid, tired of sleepless nights and constant terror. In a surge of reckless courage, or perhaps foolishness, I decided I'd had enough. With trembling legs, I climbed out of bed and approached my bedroom door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, but I forced myself to grasp it, to turn it slowly. The door creaked open, and I found myself face to face with the largest shadow figure. My voice was barely a whisper, choked with fear, but I managed to force out the words, "Daddy, is it you?" The effect was immediate and terrifying. Every single shadow figure in sight froze, their swaying movements ceasing in an instant. Then as one, they all turned to look at me. Dozens of pairs of hollow eyes fixed on my small form in the doorway. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, trembling as the entities stared at me. For the first time, I looked directly into their faces, if you could call them faces. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Their features were a void, a blackness so deep it seemed to absorb light. But their eyes, oh God, their eyes, they weren't just hollow anymore. They were filled with an awareness, an intelligence that was utterly alien and indescribably terrifying. In that moment, I realized that these weren't just shadows or tricks of the light. These were conscious entities, and they knew that I could see them. The large figure in front of me tilted its head, an eerily human gesture that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into my soul, searching, probing. I felt naked, exposed, as if every secret thought and fear was being laid bare before this otherworldly being. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to fade. Like fog dissipating in the morning sun, the shadow figures became translucent, then transparent, before disappearing altogether. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I could breathe again. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the now empty hallway. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was this some sort of waking nightmare? But deep down I knew the truth. I had confronted the entities that had haunted my nights for years, and in doing so I had changed something fundamental about our relationship. They knew I could see them, and they had chosen to leave, or at least to hide themselves better. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. I crawled back into bed, my mind reeling from the encounter. For the first time in years, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke the next morning, the world seemed different. The apartment felt lighter, cleaner somehow. And though I didn't realize it at the time, that night marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where the shadows no longer held complete power over me. The days following my confrontation with the shadow figures were filled with a strange mix of relief and unease. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without interruption. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated our apartment was gone, replaced by a stillness that was both comforting and slightly unsettling. At first, I was elated. I bounced out of bed each morning, reveling in the feeling of being well rested. My parents noticed the change immediately. The dark circles under my eyes began to fade, and I regained some of the cheerful energy that had been sapped away by years of nightly terrors. "You're looking much better, sweetheart," my mom said one morning over breakfast. "Have you been sleeping better?" I nodded, my mouth full of cereal. I wanted to tell her everything, about the shadows, about my confrontation, about the years of fear I'd endured in silence. But something held me back. A part of me was still afraid that speaking about it would somehow bring the entities back. So I swallowed my words along with my breakfast and simply said, "Yeah, I guess I have." My improved mood and energy levels didn't go unnoticed at school either. My grades began to improve, and I found myself more engaged in class discussions. My best friend, with whom I'd had that fight, approached me one day during recess. "You seem different," she said, studying me with a puzzled expression. "Did something happen?" I shrugged, offering a small smile. "I've just been sleeping better, that's all." But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, a new kind of unease began to creep in. The shadows were gone, yes, but the memory of them lingered. I found myself constantly on edge, expecting to see a dark figure out of the corner of my eye at any moment. Every unexplained sound in the apartment, a creak of the floorboards, the settling of pipes, would send my heart racing. I developed a habit of checking over my shoulder, of peering into dark corners before entering a room. The shadows were gone, but the fear remained. And then there were the dreams. Oh, the dreams. They started about a month after the confrontation. In these nightmares, I was back in that hallway, surrounded by the shadow figures. But this time, they didn't disappear when I spoke. Instead, they converged on me, their cold, empty hands reaching out, their hollow eyes boring into my soul. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. My parents, alarmed by these nightmares, suggested I see a therapist. Dr. Rosenberg was a kind, middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a soothing voice. In her office, surrounded by potted plants and calming artwork, I found myself opening up about my experiences for the first time. "Tell me about these shadows," she said during our third session, her pen poised over a notepad. I hesitated. Then the words came tumbling out. I told her everything. about the nightly visitations, the growing number of entities, the confrontation. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. It was liberating to finally share my secret, even if I wasn't sure she would believe me. Dr. Rosenberg listened without interruption, her face betraying no judgment or disbelief. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned forward. "Isabella," she said gently, "what you've been through sounds terrifying. Whether these shadows were real or a manifestation of anxiety, the fear you experienced was very real." She didn't outright dismiss my story as imagination or hallucination, which I appreciated. Instead, she focused on helping me develop coping mechanisms for my anxiety and lingering fear. As the months passed, I began to feel more in control. The nightmares became less frequent, and I found myself less jumpy in the dark. But the experience had changed me fundamentally. I now knew that there were things in this world, or perhaps beyond it, that defied explanation. And I couldn't shake the feeling that my encounter with the shadow figures was just the beginning. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon in the spring of 2006 when I stumbled upon the truth about my family's gift. I was 10 years old, spending the weekend at my grandmother Evelyn's house while my parents attended a wedding out of town. Grandma Evelyn lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of the city, a place that had always filled me with a mixture of fascination and unease. The house creaked and groaned, especially on stormy days like this one, and the antique furnishings cast strange shadows in the flickering lamplight. I was in the attic, ostensibly looking for an old board game, when I came across a dusty leather-bound book tucked away in a corner. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. As I opened it, a slip of paper fell out, a faded photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like my grandmother, but older, her face lined with wrinkles that spoke of a life filled with both joy and hardship. On the back of the photo, in spidery handwriting, was written, "Beatrice Holloway, 1902, the shadows speak to those who listen." My hands trembling, I turned back to the book. It was a journal, filled with entries dating back to the early 1900s. As I began to read, my eyes widened in shock and recognition. April 15th, 1902, the first entry began. "They came again last night, the shadow people. They move through the house as if they own it, their hollow eyes seeing everything, their silent movements a dance macabre." I sat there amidst the dust and forgotten relics of the attic, reading entry after entry. Beatrice, my great-great-grandmother, described encounters eerily similar to my own. The shadow figures, the feeling of being watched, the terror that came with the falling of night. But there was more. Beatrice wrote of learning to communicate with the shadows, of understanding their purpose. They were, she believed, guardians of some sort, entities that existed in the space between worlds, watching, waiting, protecting. "They are not evil," one entry read, though their appearance may suggest otherwise. "They are ancient, older than humanity itself. They guard the veil between worlds, and those of us who can see them are tasked with a great responsibility." As I read on, I learned about the birthmark, the crescent moon on the right cheek that marked those in our family who had the gift of sight. Beatrice had it, as did her granddaughter, my grandmother Evelyn, and now me. I was so engrossed in the journal that I didn't hear the attic door open. It wasn't until a hand gently touched my shoulder that I realized I wasn't alone. I looked up, startled, to see Grandma Evelyn standing there, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I see you've found Beatrice's journal," she said softly, lowering herself to sit beside me on the dusty floor. "I suppose it's time we had a talk, Isabella." Over cups of hot cocoa in her cozy kitchen, with rain pattering against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance, Grandma Evelyn told me everything. She confirmed what I had read in the journal, that the women in our family, every other generation, were born with the ability to see beyond the veil of our world. "It's a gift," she said, her wrinkled hands wrapped around her mug. "But it's also a tremendous responsibility. The shadows you've seen, the entities that have frightened you so, they are guardians, Isabella. They protect the boundaries between worlds, and they're drawn to those who can see them." I listened wide-eyed as she explained that the confrontation I'd had 2 years ago was a sort of test. By acknowledging the shadows, by showing courage in the face of fear, I had proven myself worthy of the gift. "But why did they leave?" I asked. thinking back to that night. Why haven't I seen them since? Grandma Evelyn smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. They didn't leave, dear. They're still there, watching, guarding. But now that you've shown you're ready, they've become more discreet. They won't reveal themselves fully again until you're prepared to take on the responsibility that comes with this gift. As she spoke, I felt a shift in my perception. The fear that had gripped me for so long began to ebb, replaced by a sense of wonder and purpose. The shadows weren't my enemies. They were allies in a cosmic dance I was only beginning to understand. What responsibility? I asked, both excited and nervous about the answer. Grandma Evelyn reached out, gently touching the birthmark on my cheek. To watch, she said softly. To listen. To stand as a bridge between worlds. The shadows will show you things, Isabella. Things that others can't see. And sometimes you'll need to act on that knowledge to help maintain the balance. As the storm raged outside, Grandma Evelyn began to teach me about our family's legacy. She told me stories of Beatrice and the women who came before her, of the shadows and the worlds beyond our own. It was the beginning of my true education, the start of a journey that would change my life forever. That night, as I lay in bed in the guest room of Grandma Evelyn's house, I felt a familiar chill in the air. But this time, instead of fear, I felt a sense of anticipation. I opened my eyes to see a shadow figure standing at the foot of my bed, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I see you, I whispered, my voice steady. And I'm ready to learn. The figure inclined its head in what seemed like approval, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. Instead, I felt like I was on the threshold of something vast and wonderful, a world of shadows and secrets that I was only beginning to understand. The years that followed my discovery in Grandma Evelyn's attic were a whirlwind of learning and adaptation. Armed with the knowledge of my family's legacy, I began to see the world and the shadows in a completely different light. Grandma Evelyn became my mentor, teaching me the ways of our family's gift. Every weekend I would visit her, eagerly absorbing every bit of wisdom she had to offer. We would sit in her garden, surrounded by the heady scent of roses and lavender, as she taught me how to hone my abilities. The key, she would say, her eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and wisdom, is to not just see the shadows, but to feel them. They communicate not through words, but through impressions, emotions, and sometimes visions. I learned to meditate, to quiet my mind and open myself to the whispers of the in-between world. It wasn't easy. There were times when the visions were so intense, so terrifying, that I would come out of my trance shaking and covered in cold sweat. One particular session stands out in my memory. I was 13, sitting cross-legged in Grandma Evelyn's attic, surrounded by candles. As I slipped into a meditative state, the shadows began to swirl around me, taking on forms both familiar and utterly alien. Suddenly, I was no longer in the attic. I found myself standing on a desolate plain, the sky above me a roiling mass of dark clouds. In the distance, I could see a tear in the fabric of reality, a gash in the world that pulsed with an otherworldly light. Shadow figures streamed towards this breach, their movements urgent and purposeful. As I watched, transfixed, I felt a sense of impending doom wash over me. Something was coming through that tear, something that didn't belong in our world. The shadows were fighting to close it, to push back whatever was trying to break through. I woke from the vision with a gasp, my heart pounding. Grandma Evelyn was there, her cool hand on my forehead, her voice soothing as she brought me back to reality. What you saw, she explained once I had calmed down, was a glimpse of the shadow's purpose. They guard the boundaries between worlds, preventing things from crossing over that could upset the balance. These visions became more frequent as my training progressed. Sometimes they were glimpses of other worlds, beautiful and terrible in their alienness. Other times they were warnings of potential breaches, places where the veil between worlds was growing thin. But it wasn't all intense visions and cosmic battles. I also learned to use my gift in smaller, more practical ways. I could sense the lingering emotions in a room, the echoes of past events that clung to places and objects. This ability came in handy in unexpected ways. There was the time I helped my best friend find a cherished locket that had belonged to her grandmother. As soon as I entered her room, I could sense the item's presence. could feel the love and memories attached to it. I was drawn to a corner of the room where the locket had fallen behind a dresser, or the instance when I sensed a dark, oppressive energy in a new student's home while working on a school project. Through careful questioning, I discovered she was being abused by her stepfather. With my parents' help, we were able to alert the authorities and get her to safety. These small acts of help, guided by my ability to see and sense what others couldn't, gave me a sense of purpose. I was using my gift not just for some grand cosmic balance, but to make a real difference in people's lives. But with this growing power came growing responsibility. The shadows began to appear more frequently, no longer content to simply observe. They would guide me to places where my intervention was needed, showing me visions of people in distress, or locations where the veil between worlds was dangerously thin. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, the remnants of a vision clinging to my mind like cobwebs. Days when the constant presence of the shadows left me feeling drained and isolated. My parents, bless them, tried their best to understand. Though they couldn't see what I saw, they supported me in every way they could. My mom would hold me after particularly rough nights, not asking for explanations, just offering comfort. My dad would make lighthearted jokes about having a supernatural early warning system in the family, his humor helping to ease the tension. But despite their love and support, I couldn't shake the feeling of being different, set apart from the normal world. As I entered my teen years, this sense of otherness only grew stronger. While my classmates worried about dates and dances, I was grappling with visions of other worlds and the responsibility of maintaining cosmic balance. There were times when I resented my gift, when I longed for the blissful ignorance of a normal life. But then I would remember Grandma Evelyn's words. With great power comes great responsibility, yes, but also great wonder, and the chance to make a real difference in this world and others. And so I persevered, honing my skills, learning to balance my normal life with my supernatural responsibilities. Little did I know that all of this was merely preparation for the greatest challenge I would face. A threat to not just our world, but to the very fabric of reality itself. As I entered my 16th year, there was a palpable change in the air. The shadows grew more agitated, their movements more frenzied. My visions became more frequent and intense, filled with images of cosmic upheaval and impending doom. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything came to a head. I was walking home from a late study session at the library, the streets quiet save for the rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. As I turned onto my street, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. The shadows were gathering. They swirled around me, their forms more distinct than I had ever seen them. Their hollow eyes were filled with an urgency that sent my heart racing. Without warning, I was plunged into a vision more vivid and terrifying than any I had experienced before. I saw our world, but it was wrong, twisted. The sky was a sickly green, pulsing with eldritch energies. Buildings warped and shifted, their architecture defying the laws of physics. And everywhere there were things, creatures that should not exist in our reality, their forms so alien and horrifying that my mind rebelled at the sight of them. In the center of this chaos, I saw a tear in the fabric of reality, a yawning void that pulsed with malevolent energy. Shadow figures fought desperately against a tide of nightmarish entities pouring through the breach, but they were being overwhelmed. As quickly as it had begun, the vision ended. I found myself on my knees on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, cold sweat soaking my clothes. The shadows swirled around me, their movements agitated and purposeful. I stumbled to my feet and ran the rest of the way home. I burst through the front door, startling my parents who were watching TV in the living room. "We need to call Grandma Evelyn," I gasped out. "Now." Within an hour, Grandma Evelyn arrived, her face grave as I recounted my vision. She listened without interruption, her eyes growing more troubled with each word. "It's as we feared," she said when I had finished. "The balance is shifting. Something is trying to break through, something that could destroy not just our world, but countless others." She turned to my parents, who were listening with a mixture of confusion and concern. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but I need to take Isabella with me." "What's coming? She's the only one who can stop it." My parents protested, of course, the idea of their 16-year-old daughter going off to fight some cosmic horror, was understandably hard to swallow. But in the end, faced with the gravity of the situation and my own determination, they reluctantly agreed. That night, as I packed a bag with shaking hands, the reality of what I was about to face hit me. I was terrified, yes, but there was also a sense of purpose, of rightness. This was what I had been preparing for all these years, whether I had known it or not. As Grandma Evelyn and I drove through the night, she explained more about what we were facing. "There are places," she said, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, "where the boundaries between worlds are thinner. Places where great power has been wielded or great evil committed. The shadows guard these places, but sometimes something slips through." We were headed to one such place, an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. According to Grandma Evelyn, it had once been the site of experiments in quantum physics, experiments that had torn holes in the fabric of reality. "The shadows have been fighting to keep these breaches closed for years," she explained. "But now, something on the other side has found a way to force them open. If we don't stop it, our world and countless others will be overrun." As we neared our destination, I could feel the wrongness in the air. The shadows here were agitated, moving in patterns I had never seen before. The very air seemed to shimmer and warp, as if the laws of physics were breaking down. We parked some distance away and approached on foot. The industrial complex loomed before us, its abandoned buildings casting long, unnatural shadows in the moonlight. As we drew closer, I could see shadow figures flitting between the structures, their movements frantic and desperate. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy that made my skin crawl. Each step closer to the complex felt like wading through molasses, as if reality itself was resisting our presence. "Isabella," Grandma Evelyn said, her voice tight with tension, "what we're about to face, it's beyond anything you've encountered before. Remember your training. Trust in the shadows and in yourself." I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump of fear in my throat. As we approached the main building, a massive warehouse with broken windows and rusted metal siding, I could feel the wrongness emanating from within. It was like a black hole of negative energy, sucking in everything around it. We pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The interior was a nightmare of twisted metal and pulsing, otherworldly light. In the center of the warehouse floor, a tear in reality hung suspended in the air. It was like looking at a rip in the fabric of the world, edges jagged and pulsing with sickly green energy. Shadow figures swarmed around the breach, their forms stretching and distorting as they fought to keep it closed. But it was a losing battle. As we watched, horror-struck, a tentacle of pure darkness snaked through the opening, followed by another and another. "It's coming through," Grandma Evelyn whispered, her face pale in the eerie light. "Isabella, you know what you have to do." I did know, though the knowledge filled me with terror. I had to use my gift, my connection to the shadows, to help seal the breach. But doing so would put me in direct contact with whatever was on the other side. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward. The shadows swirled around me, their cold touch familiar and almost comforting. I closed my eyes and opened my mind, reaching out to connect with the guardian entities. The moment I made contact, I was assaulted by a wave of alien thoughts and emotions. The shadows were ancient, their consciousness vast and incomprehensible. But underlying it all was a sense of desperate urgency. They needed my help. Guided by instinct and years of training, I began to weave my consciousness with theirs. I could feel the power building, a force that transcended the physical world. Together, we pushed against the encroaching darkness, fighting to close the breach. The entity on the other side fought back. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, striking at my mind with terrifying force. Images flooded my consciousness, worlds consumed by chaos, realities twisted beyond recognition, an endless hunger that threatened to devour everything. I screamed, the sound lost in the howling vortex of energy that surrounded us. The pain was excruciating, like my very soul was being torn apart. But I couldn't give up. The fate of not just our world, but countless others, hung in the balance. Drawing on every ounce of strength I possessed, I pushed back against the darkness. I thought of my family, my friends, of all the people I'd helped with my gift. I thought of the beauty of our world, of all the worlds I'd glimpsed in my visions, And I thought of the shadows, the ancient guardians who had watched over reality for eons. With a final desperate surge of will, we forced the breach closed. There was a sound like reality itself screaming, and then silence. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse. Grandma Evelyn was kneeling beside me, tears streaming down her face. The shadows swirled around us, their movements now calm and almost grateful. "You did it, Isabella," Grandma Evelyn whispered, helping me sit up. "You closed the breach." As the reality of what had just happened sank in, I felt a mix of exhaustion, relief, and something else, a sense of completion. I had faced my greatest challenge and against all odds had emerged victorious. But as we made our way out of the warehouse on shaky legs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The entity we had forced back, it was still out there, still hungry, and there were other weak points in reality, other places where the veil between worlds was thin. Our battle was won, but the war was far from over. In the days and weeks that followed the incident at the warehouse, life took on a surreal quality. On the surface, everything seemed normal. I went back to school, hung out with friends, did my homework. But underneath it all was the knowledge that I had faced down a cosmic horror and lived to tell the tale. The shadows were ever present, but they were different now. There was a new respect in the way they moved around me, a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. They were no longer just entities I could see. They were allies, comrades in arms. Grandma Evelyn stepped up my training, pushing me to develop my abilities further. "What happened at the warehouse was just the beginning," she would say, her eyes serious. "We need to be prepared for what might come next." And so I trained. I learned to project my consciousness across vast distances, to see through the eyes of shadows half a world away. I honed my ability to sense disturbances in reality, to feel the ebb and flow of energies most humans couldn't even comprehend. But it wasn't all cosmic battles and interdimensional threats. There were still the day-to-day uses of my gift, the small ways I could help people in my community. I helped the police locate missing persons using my ability to sense lingering emotions and memories. I counseled people dealing with hauntings or unexplained phenomena, using my knowledge to bring them peace. One particularly memorable case involved a young girl who was terrified of her own shadow. Her parents had taken her to doctors and therapists, but nothing seemed to help. When they came to me, desperate for any solution, I immediately sensed the problem. The girl's fear wasn't irrational. Her shadow really was alive in a sense. A minor spirit had attached itself to her, drawn by her natural sensitivity to the supernatural. With the help of the shadow guardians, I was able to communicate with the spirit and convince it to move on. The look of relief on the girl's face when she realized her shadow was just a shadow again was something I'll never forget. It was moments like these that made all the danger and responsibility worthwhile. But even as I helped others and continued my training, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen through the breach. The entity we had forced back. It was still out there, waiting. I could feel it sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, a malevolent presence pressing against the barriers of our reality, searching for another way in. Grandma Evelyn sensed my unease. "The battle is never truly over, Isabella," she told me one evening as we sat in her garden watching the shadows lengthen as the sun set. "That's the burden of our gift. We stand as guardians, always vigilant, always ready." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. This was my life now. Not just a high school student with an unusual ability, but a protector of reality itself. It was a heavy responsibility, but one I was prepared to bear. As if in response to my thoughts, the shadows around us stirred. I felt a familiar chill run down my spine and knew that somewhere, the veil between worlds was growing thin once again. I stood up, brushing off my jeans. Grandma Evelyn looked at me, a mixture of pride and concern in her eyes. "Ready?" she asked. I took a deep breath, feeling the power of the shadows swirling around me, through me. I thought of all I had learned, all I had experienced. I thought of the entity waiting in the darkness between worlds, and of all the people, in this world and others, who were counting on me, even if they didn't know it. "Ready," I replied. As we headed off into the gathering dusk, I couldn't help but smile. This was my life now, strange, terrifying, wondrous, and more important than I could have ever imagined. The shadows were my allies, the space between worlds my battlefield, and the safety of reality my responsibility. It wasn't the life I had expected, but it was mine, and I wouldn't have it any other way.